Welcome to Moonlit Romance Library. Please follow for more stories. Chapter 1: The Hall of the Moon Vow. The Moon Vow Hall of the Black Pine Pack had stood for 400 years, and in all that time, no Luna had ever been replaced in front of her own people on the night of her own renewal ceremony while wearing the ceremonial silver she had polished herself that morning. Seraphine Marlowe had that honor. She stood at the foot of the moonstone dais where she had stood every winter for 6 years, her golden hair braided with pine sprigs in the old way, and watched her mate, her alpha, her first love, the man whose fever she had once sweated out of him with her own hands for 9 straight nights, walk into the hall with another woman on his arm. The whispers started before Roderick even reached the dais. They rolled through the packed hall like wind through wheat. "Who is that?" "A northern lady. Look at the fur on her cloak. That's white winter fox. That's a fortune on her shoulders. Where is she supposed to stand? There's only one place for a woman to stand up there." Roderick Blackpine was, as always, devastatingly handsome. That was the cruelest part. If he had been ugly, if he had been dull or coarse or weak-jawed, Seraphine might have convinced herself she had never really loved him. But Roderick was tall and dark-haired and built like a war poem, with gray eyes that could make a woman forget her own name when they softened, which they used to do, often, when he looked at her. They did not soften now. He walked with the northern woman past the long tables where Seraphine had arranged the winter feast herself. The roast venison she had traded 2 bolts of good linen to secure, the root vegetables from the cellar she had reorganized in September, the honey mead she had bartered from the river merchants using a credit line she had personally guaranteed. He walked past all of it as though it had appeared by magic, and he stopped at the foot of the dais, and he did not look at Seraphine. "Members of the Black Pine Pack," Roderick said, and his voice filled the hall the way it always did, like a bell rung inside a cathedral. "Honored elders, bonded families. Tonight is the night of the moon vow, when the Alpha reaffirms his bond and presents his Luna to the watching moon." Seraphine's hands were steady at her sides. She had rehearsed her part. She would step forward, Roderick would take her hand, they would speak the old words, and the winter would be sealed. She had done this 5 times before. She knew the cadence of it, the way she knew her own heartbeat. "Tonight," Roderick continued, "I present a new bond." The hall went so quiet that Seraphine heard a log shift in the great fireplace 30 feet away. "Lady Alara Winterbourne, of the Northern Winterbourne family, has accepted the position of Luna of the Black Pine Pack." The woman beside him stepped forward, and Seraphine got her first real look at the person who was replacing her. Alara Winterbourne was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, precise, polished, and utterly without warmth. She had dark auburn hair coiled at the base of her neck, skin like parchment that had never seen honest sun, and eyes the color of frozen river water. She wore white winter fox across her shoulders and a gown of midnight blue velvet that must have cost more than the Black Pine Pack's entire autumn grain budget. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her expression was one of serene, practiced modesty, the kind of modesty that says, "I have already won, and I am being gracious about it." She was also, Seraphine noticed with a clarity that surprised her, wearing a betrothal chain that had been forged at least 3 months ago. The silver had already developed the specific patina that comes from being worn daily against skin. 3 months. Roderick had been planning this for 3 months, through the autumn harvest that Seraphine had managed, through the Salt Road dispute that Seraphine had negotiated, through the silver mine transport crisis that Seraphine had solved by riding out to the mountain pass herself in early snow. 3 months of smiling at her across the breakfast table, of accepting her reports on grain stores, of letting her work herself raw to hold his pack together, while this chain cooled against another woman's throat. Seraphine looked at Roderick. For the first time since he had entered the hall, he looked back. She saw it in his eyes. Not cruelty, not hatred, not even indifference. Something worse. Relief. He was relieved to be done with her. Not because he had never loved her. He had, she knew that with the certainty of 6 years of shared nights and whispered promises and the specific way he used to press his face against her hair and breathe her in like she was the only clean air in the world. He had loved her. But loving Seraphine Marlowe came with a price that Roderick Blackpine had decided he could no longer afford. She was too competent, too necessary, too much. When Aluna runs the grain stores and the salt road and the medicine supply and the merchant contacts and the elder relationships, the alpha starts to feel like a figurehead. When Aluna solves crises faster than the alpha hears about them, the pack starts to look at her first and him second. When Aluna is brilliant and capable and golden-haired and universally respected, the alpha starts to wonder if his pack is really his pack or hers. Roderick had found a solution. He had found Aluna who came with an army, a treasury, and a family name that would make other packs think twice before challenging him, and who would, by all appearances, be content to stand at his side and look decorative. It was, from a certain angle, almost reasonable. From where Seraphine was standing, it was the most breathtaking betrayal she had ever experienced, and she had once watched a merchant try to sell her a crate of sawdust labeled as cinnamon. "Seraphine," Roderick said, and his voice was careful now, the way it got when he was handling something he expected to break. "I know this is not what you anticipated for tonight's ceremony. I want you to know that your years of service to this pack—" "Service," Seraphine repeated, and the word came out flat and precise, like a coin dropped on stone. "Are deeply valued. A home has been prepared for you at the eastern edge of the territory, near the border crossing. It's comfortable, warm. You'll receive a monthly allowance and—" "The eastern border cottage," Seraphine said. "The one with the leak in the north wall that I submitted a repair request for in August, which was denied because, and I am quoting your steward, there are higher priorities for the carpentry budget." A small, horrible silence. Elder Marin, seated at the front table, made a sound that was very carefully not a laugh. "The cottage has been repaired," Roderick said tightly. "How wonderful. It only took replacing your Luna to get a roof patched." Seraphine's voice was perfectly level. She was aware, with the strange, doubled vision that comes in moments of absolute crisis, that every person in this hall was watching her for the breakdown. They were waiting for tears, for begging, for the satisfying spectacle of a discarded woman falling apart in public so that everyone could feel sorry for her and then go back to their venison. She would not give them that. She would give them something much worse. "You mentioned my years of service," Seraphine said, and she reached into the embroidered belt pouch at her waist, the one she had sewn herself, the one that contained the tools of every function she had performed for this pack for 6 years. "Let me return what belongs to the position." She pulled out a heavy iron key on a leather cord. The granary key. Main store, reserve store, emergency winter reserve. She placed it on the edge of the dais. "The river merchants renew the winter grain credit in 11 days. They renew it with me because I am the one who has paid them, fed their drivers, and kept their caravans safe for 6 years. If I am no longer Luna, 40% of your winter grain stops at the river." The hall went quiet enough for the fire to sound loud. She drew out a small leather medicine ledger. "The Ashwick herb women supply our feverfew, willow bark, and wound seal poultice. Their payment is due in 6 days. They do not extend credit to men who remember sick rooms only when they need a heroic speech beside one." She set the ledger beside the key. "Without this, the deep winter comes with no fever medicine and no wound treatment." Then came a wooden passage token stamped with pine and road. "The Salt Road Agreement. Renewed 9 days ago in my name because Greymarch trusts the woman who actually sends the wagons on time." The token clicked against the stone. "If I am removed, this token dies in 30 days. 3 objects. Grain, medicine, road. Even the oldest grandmother in the hall could count them, and every person understood what they meant: food, survival, and a way out of winter." Seraphine left the rest in her pouch. The firewood contracts, the tallow notes, the cobbler favors, the elder grudges, the little human details that made a pack function. She would not drown the room in paper. She would let them discover those losses one by one when the first child needed boots and the first hearth ran cold. "There," Seraphine said. The position of Luna returned in full. She looked at Alara Winterbourne, who was standing very still, her pale eyes moving over the key, the medicine ledger, and the road token with an expression Seraphine recognized. The expression of a woman doing rapid mental arithmetic and not liking the sum. I'm sure Lady Winterbourne will find it manageable, Seraphine said pleasantly. She looks like a woman who enjoys a challenge. Roderick's jaw was tight. Seraphine, this display is unnecessary. Is it? She turned to him, and for the first time something hot flickered in her golden brown eyes. You are replacing me in front of the entire pack on the night of the moon vow. You have been planning this for at least 3 months, based on the age of Lady Winterbourne's betrothal chain. You did not tell me. You did not warn me. You let me organize this feast, polish the ceremonial silver, braid my hair in the old way, and walk into this hall believing I was still your Luna. If anyone in this room is putting on an unnecessary display, Roderick, it is not me. The silence was so complete that Seraphine heard Elder Marin's knuckles crack. You may keep the eastern border cottage, Seraphine said, and the monthly allowance. I will not be a pensioned-off inconvenience living at the edge of your territory, tending a garden while your new Luna wears my ceremonial silver and pretends she knows where the salt comes from. She reached up and unclipped the thin silver chain at her throat, the Luna's chain, the one Roderick had clasped there 6 years ago with shaking hands and wet eyes. She set it on the dais with the rest. What I will take, she said, are my personal effects, my private account ledger, my correspondence, and my own savings, which I earned through personal trade commissions before I was your Luna and which are mine by law. Roderick's face had gone through several colors during her speech. It had settled on a pale, rigid mask that Seraphine knew meant he was furious and knew he had no right to be. Where will you go? He asked. That, Seraphine said, is no longer your concern. She turned and walked toward the great doors of the Moonvow Hall. The crowd parted for her, not out of respect, not yet, but out of the universal human instinct to get out of the way of a woman who is clearly capable of setting a building on fire with nothing but her organizational skills. Behind her, she heard Alara Winterbourne's voice for the first time, soft and musical and perfectly modulated. Should someone go after her? And Roderick's voice, tight and defensive. She'll be fine, she always is. Seraphine's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. The pain was useful. It kept her spine straight and her eyes dry for the 47 steps it took to cross the hall, push open the iron-banded doors, and step into the freezing November night. The doors closed behind her. She made it to the courtyard wall before her knees buckled. Chapter 2: The Border and the Rabbit. The pain of a severed mate bond is not metaphorical. Seraphine had read about it in the old texts, the scrolls she had cataloged and preserved in the Blackpine archive, because no one else thought the archive was worth maintaining. The texts described it as a rending of the soul thread, which she had always thought was poetic exaggeration. It was not poetic exaggeration. It hit her 3 miles past the border marker, where Blackpine territory ended and the wild borderlands began. She was walking fast, her winter cloak pulled tight, her satchel of account ledgers and correspondence banging against her hip, her breath coming in sharp white clouds. The November rain had started an hour ago, thin and bitter and relentless. The kind of rain that doesn't soak you all at once, but seeps in through every seam until you realize you are wet to the bone and your fingers have stopped working. The bond snapped like a bowstring. Seraphine gasped, stumbled, and went down on her hands and knees in the mud of the border road. The pain was enormous, not in one place but everywhere, as though every nerve in her body had been stripped raw and dragged across gravel. Her wolf, the silver wolf that lived behind her ribs, howled, a long, thin, terrible sound that only she could hear. He does not want us. She pressed her forehead to the mud and breathed. Rain ran down her neck, under her collar, along her spine. Her fingers clawed at the ground. The account ledger in her satchel, the one she had refused to leave behind, the one that contained every debt, every credit, every supply line, every contact, every piece of information that made the Blackpine Pack a functioning entity, rather than a collection of wolves arguing over scraps, pressed its leather corner into her ribs like a second heartbeat. She did not let go of it. She got up. She wiped her face, which accomplished nothing because the rain immediately replaced everything she had wiped away. She picked up her satchel, slung it across her body, and kept walking. The borderway station appeared through the rain like a smudge of warm light. a low stone building with a thatched roof and a stable yard, sitting at the junction of the East Road and the old trade path that ran south to the river towns. It was not a grand building. It was the kind of place where traveling merchants, lone riders, and border wolves stopped for a hot meal and a dry corner before continuing into uncertain territory. Seraphine pushed open the door and was hit by the smell of wood smoke, mutton stew, and wet dog. The common room was half full. A few merchants hunched over their bowls, a pair of border guards playing dice, an old woman knitting in the chimney corner. No one looked up. In the borderlands, people minded their own business. It was safer that way. The innkeeper, a stout woman with arms like fence posts and a face that suggested she had once headbutted a mule and the mule had lost, looked Seraphine up and down. "Room? If you have one." "Last one on the left upstairs, 3 coppers, suppers included. You look like you need it." Seraphine paid. Her fingers were shaking, but she counted the coins accurately. She would always count coins accurately. The world could end, and Seraphine Marlowe would die with her accounts balanced. She climbed the stairs, found the room, a narrow cell with a straw mattress, a woolen blanket, and a window that looked out onto the stable yard, and sat on the bed. She did not cry. She sat very still with her hands on her account ledger and waited for the trembling to stop. It did not stop. She went back downstairs. The kitchen was accessible through a side door that someone had left propped open with a brick. Seraphine told herself she was looking for hot water for her face, or perhaps a candle, or perhaps any small practical task that would give her hands something to do besides shake. What she found behind the kitchen's back door, in the narrow, muddy alley where the kitchen scraps were thrown, was a rabbit. It was small and white and round, with ears that were slightly too long for its body and eyes the color of dark cherries. It was sitting in the rain next to an overturned crate, and it was eating a cabbage leaf. Or rather, it was clutching a cabbage leaf in its mouth with the grim, unshakable determination of a creature that had decided this cabbage leaf was the hill it would die on, while the kitchen boy, a lanky teenager with a dripping nose, tried to shoo it away with a broom. "Get off. That's not for you, you stupid. Go on, get." The boy swiped the broom at the rabbit. The rabbit did not move. It hunched lower over its cabbage leaf and chewed faster. "I said get." Another swipe. The rabbit dodged the broom with a small, indignant hop and resumed chewing. The cabbage leaf was now considerably smaller, but the rabbit showed no intention of surrendering what remained. "You little," the boy raised the broom higher. "Stop." Seraphine's voice came out sharper than she intended. The boy turned, saw a golden-haired woman standing in the kitchen doorway with rain in her hair and murder in her eyes, and prudently lowered the broom. "It's just a rabbit, miss. It keeps getting into the vegetable stores." "Then fix the latch on your vegetable stores." Seraphine walked past the boy, crouched in the mud. She was already so wet and filthy that a little more made no difference, and looked at the rabbit. The rabbit looked at her. It had stopped chewing. The cabbage leaf hung from its mouth like a limp green flag. Its dark cherry eyes were very round, and its nose was twitching in the rapid, assessing way that rabbits' noses twitch when they are deciding whether a new person is a threat, a friend, or irrelevant. Seraphine held out her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. She did not move. She barely breathed. The rabbit considered her for a long moment. Then it hopped forward, one small, careful hop, and pressed its nose against her fingertips. Its nose was cold and wet and impossibly soft, and it twitched 3 times against her skin before the rabbit apparently decided that Seraphine was acceptable. It hopped into her lap. It was warm, absurdly warm the way small animals always are, as though they contain a furnace somewhere beneath their fur that is wildly out of proportion to their size. It settled against her stomach, tucked its feet underneath itself, and continued eating the cabbage leaf. Seraphine sat in the mud in the rain behind a border way station kitchen, holding a rabbit that had been thrown out of the only place it knew for the crime of trying to feed itself, and she thought, well, we match. She carried it inside. No one stopped her. The innkeeper looked at the rabbit, looked at Seraphine's face, and said nothing. There were some faces you did not argue with. Upstairs, Seraphine set the rabbit on the bed. It explored the blanket with the thorough, methodical intensity of a creature cataloging its new territory, circled 3 times, and flopped onto its side. Seraphine sat beside it, opened her account ledger, and began to read. The numbers were familiar, comforting. Every line in this ledger represented a relationship she had built, a deal she had struck, a crisis she had solved. The river merchants, the Salt Road Passage, the Heartwood Carriers Guild, the Herb Women of Ashwick, the quarterly grain deliveries, the winter tallow supply, the emergency credit line with the Greymark banking house. These were hers, not Roderick's, not the Blackpine Pack's, hers. She had built them with her own mind, her own hands, her own relentless competence. And when Roderick Blackpine stood in his Moonvow Hall with his beautiful northern bride and realized that his granary was emptying, his salt road was closing, his medicine supply was vanishing, his silver mine wagons were not arriving, and his elders were asking uncomfortable questions about where the woman who actually ran everything had gone, these relationships would still be hers. The rabbit nudged its nose against her ankle. She reached down and stroked its ears without looking, her eyes still on the ledger. "I'm going to need a name for you," she said. The rabbit thumped one hind leg against the mattress, a small, decisive thump, the sound a rabbit makes when it is either content or staking a claim. "Clover," Seraphine said, "because you are small, round, and apparently impossible to uproot." Clover thumped again and went to sleep. Chapter 3. The Border Wolf King. The rain stopped sometime before dawn. Seraphine knew this because she had not slept. The broken bond ached in her chest like a cracked rib, pulsing with every heartbeat, and she had heard every shift in the weather, every creak of the building, every snore from the common room below. She heard the riders arrive at first light. Not merchants. Merchants traveled in carts. These were mounted riders, heavy horses, moving in formation. She heard the jingle of tack, the low murmur of voices accustomed to command, and distantly, the whine of wolves. Border wolves, big ones, from the sound of their vocal range. Seraphine was dressed and packed in 3 minutes. She had not unpacked much. She was a woman who understood that situations could change quickly, and she kept her belongings in a state of permanent readiness. The only concession to the night was that Clover was now riding in the front fold of her cloak, a warm white lump against her collarbone, ears flat, nose twitching. She came down the stairs with her satchel on her hip, her golden hair in a single damp braid, her spine straight, and her face arranged in the polite, competent mask she had worn for 6 years of managing a pack that did not appreciate her. The common room was full of soldiers. Not soldiers in the ragged, improvised way that pack warriors sometimes were. These were uniformed, dark leather and gray wool, steel-reinforced bracers, weapons that were clean and oiled and clearly used regularly. They moved with the easy discipline of men who had been well-trained and well-fed, and who answered to someone they genuinely respected rather than merely feared. At the center of the room, seated at the largest table with a map spread before him and a cup of tea steaming at his elbow, was the most handsome man Seraphine had ever seen. She was irritated by this. She had just been publicly humiliated, thrown out of her home, and severed from her mate bond. Her clothes were mud-stained, her hair was a disaster, and she had a rabbit in her cloak. She was not in the mood to notice that a man was handsome. But the universe, apparently, did not care about her mood. He was tall. Taller than Roderick, which she would not have thought possible, since Roderick's height had been one of his most weaponized attributes. His hair was dark, nearly black, cut shorter than the Blackpine fashion, and his jaw was the kind of jaw that made portrait painters weep with gratitude. He had a scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, not disfiguring, merely interesting, the kind of scar that suggested a story worth hearing. His eyes were a deep, startling blue, and they were currently fixed on the map in front of him with an expression of calm, focused intelligence that Seraphine recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. He looked up. Their eyes met. Seraphine felt absurdly as though the floor had tilted. Not dramatically, not the sweeping, world-stopping way the bards described it. Just a small, subtle shift, as though gravity had quietly rearranged itself around a new center. The man's blue eyes moved from her face to her mud-stained cloak, to the satchel on her hip, specifically to the account ledger visible through the satchel's unbuckled flap, and back to her face. His expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened, the way a blade sharpens when it finds the right angle against a whetstone. "You're the Black Pine Luna," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement, delivered in a voice like dark oak, deep, steady, and suggesting structural integrity. "Former," Seraphine corrected. "As of when?" "Last night." One of the soldiers near the door glanced up. The innkeeper, who had been very carefully pretending to polish a mug, stopped pretending. The man at the table studied her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Sit down." "I don't know who you are." "Cale Ashbourne, Alpha of the Iron Ridge Border Pack, Lord Warden of the Eastern March." He paused. "Some people call me the Border Wolf King, which is dramatic, but not entirely inaccurate." Seraphine had heard of him. Everyone had heard of him. Cale Ashbourne held the borderlands between the settled Pack territories and the wild country to the east, a vast, ungoverned stretch of mountain, forest, and trade road that every merchant, every caravan, and every supply chain had to cross. He controlled the passes, the bridges, the river crossings, and the way station network. He was, in practical terms, the man who decided what moved through the borderlands and what did not. He was also, she realized with a start, the man who had been quietly investigating irregularities on the northern trade roads for the past 6 months. She knew this because the Heartwood Carriers Guildmaster had mentioned it, nervously, in his last letter to her. "Sit down," he said again, and this time it was softer. Not a command, an offer. She sat. Clover, disturbed by the change in altitude, shifted inside her cloak. A tiny white ear poked above Seraphine's collar, rotated once like a small furry periscope, and disappeared back into the fabric. Cale Ashbourne looked at the place where the ear had been. He looked at Seraphine. One corner of his mouth moved by approximately 1/16 of an inch. "Is there a rabbit in your cloak?" he asked. "There might be." "Does it have a name?" "Clover." "Of course it does." He took a sip of his tea. "You crossed the border last night, in the rain, without escort, with a broken mate bond and," his eyes dropped to her satchel again, "what appears to be a full set of commercial account records." "I was not offered an escort. I was offered a leaking cottage and a monthly allowance." "And you chose the rain." "The rain doesn't condescend to me." That 16th of an inch movement at the corner of his mouth happened again. Seraphine was beginning to suspect it was his version of a smile. "I've been watching the Black Pine Pack's trade activity for 6 months, he said. Specifically, the northern supply contracts that changed hands after the Winterbourne betrothal was announced. Grain prices tripled on the Black Pine purchase orders. The Salt Road usage fees doubled. The Silver Mine transport contract was renegotiated with a penalty clause that didn't exist before." He paused. All of these changes happened after Lady Winterbourne's family began their involvement with the Black Pine Pack, and all of the original contracts that kept prices stable were negotiated by one person. He looked at her. "You," he said. "Yes." The Black Pine Pack is approximately 30 days from a full winter supply crisis. Their grain will run short in 3 weeks. Their Salt Road closes in a month. Their medicine supply ends in 6 days. Their silver mine transport is in default. "Yes." "And the woman who built and maintained every single one of those supply lines is currently sitting in a border way station with a rabbit in her cloak." "Yes." Cale Ashbourne set down his tea. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and regarded her with an expression that contained, in carefully measured proportions, respect, calculation, and something that Seraphine could not immediately identify, but that made the broken place in her chest feel slightly less broken. "Lady Marlowe," he said, "I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss. I am no longer a lady of anything." "That," he said, "is a matter of perspective and paperwork." He stood. He was even taller standing, which seemed structurally unnecessary. "I'm riding to Iron Ridge Keep this morning. My steward has been telling me for 6 months that our border trade network needs an overhaul, and I have been ignoring him because I don't have anyone who understands supply chains well enough to do it. You clearly do. He paused. I can offer you border passage rights, a room in the keep, access to the Merchant Guild Hall, and the legal status of a trade advisor under my protection. In return, I would like you to look at my trade routes and tell me where they're bleeding money. Seraphine stared at him. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a starting position. What you do with it is your decision. You don't know me. I know your work. I've been reading the trade records from the Black Pine Pack's supply chain for 6 months. I know that before you took over, their grain costs were 30% higher. I know that the Salt Road agreement you negotiated saved them 600 silver marks a year. I know that the Heartwood Carriers Guildmaster calls you the only honest dealer north of the river. And I know, he paused, and his blue eyes held hers with an intensity that made Clover thump nervously against her collarbone, that a man who had all of that and threw it away to marry a Winterborn is either a fool or a coward, and I don't particularly care which. The common room was very quiet. Every soldier, the innkeeper, and the old woman knitting in the chimney corner were pretending very hard not to listen. Seraphine's throat was tight. Not from tears, she would not cry in front of this man, in front of anyone, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being seen. Not pitied, not managed, not handled, seen. I have a rabbit, she said, because she was the kind of person who disclosed potential complications up front. I noticed. She eats cabbage leaves and thumps when she's startled. My keep has a kitchen garden. She'll fit right in. He extended his hand, not to shake, to help her stand, the way a man offers his hand when he wants a woman to know that he considers her his equal, and that the hand is offered by choice, not obligation. Seraphine looked at his hand. It was large and scarred and steady. She took it. His grip was warm and firm and lasted exactly 1 second longer than strictly necessary. When he let go, his fingers brushed her palm in a way that could have been accidental but was not. Clover thumped. Your rabbit approves, Cale said. My rabbit approves of very little. She merely tolerates what she cannot kick. That 1/16 of an inch smile happened a third time, and Seraphine realized, with a sensation like stepping off a cliff into unexpectedly warm water, that she wanted to make it happen again. Chapter 4: Iron Ridge Keep. Iron Ridge Keep sat on a granite bluff above the border river, where the old trade road forked, one branch running north to the settled Pack territories, the other running south to the river port towns and the merchant guilds beyond. It was not a beautiful building. It was a functional one. Thick walls, deep cellars, wide gates designed for wagons, and a stable yard that could hold 50 horses. It looked like a building that had been designed by someone who valued efficiency over aesthetics, which was exactly the kind of building Seraphine felt most comfortable in. Cale Ashbourne had given her a room in the East Tower. Not the finest room in the keep, but a good one, with a window that overlooked the river and the trade road, a fireplace that drew properly, and a desk. The desk was large. Seraphine approved of large desks. She had spent 6 years managing the Black Pine Pack's entire commercial infrastructure from a writing table that was slightly too small because Roderick had never thought to ask if she needed a bigger one. Clover was given the run of the kitchen garden, which she investigated with the methodical intensity of a land surveyor, and from which she returned each evening with dirt on her nose and an expression of profound satisfaction. Within 3 days, Seraphine had mapped the Iron Ridge trade network. Within a week, she had found where it was bleeding money. The border trade routes were a mess, not from corruption but from neglect. Cale Ashbourne was a superb military commander and a respected alpha, but he had the commercial instincts of a brick. His steward, a well-meaning man named Aldrich, had been doing his best, but his best involved paying whatever price the merchants quoted and hoping for the best. Seraphine did not hope for the best. Seraphine negotiated. She started with the grain merchants. The Iron Ridge Pack was buying winter grain from 3 separate suppliers at 3 different prices, none of which had been compared or renegotiated in 2 years. Seraphine sat in the Merchant Guild Hall, a drafty stone building in the border town below the keep, and invited all 3 suppliers to the same meeting. Gentlemen, she said with Clover tucked invisibly under her heavy wool skirt, I noticed that you are each charging the Iron Ridge pack a different price for the same grade of grain. This suggests either that grain quality varies dramatically between your warehouses, which would concern me, or that you have been taking advantage of the fact that no one here has bothered to compare your invoices, which would also concern me. The grain merchants looked at each other. They looked at the golden-haired woman sitting at the head of the table with her hands folded and her expression pleasant and her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. They lowered their prices, all three of them, voluntarily. That, Aldrich said afterward with the dazed expression of a man who has just witnessed a miracle, has never happened before. It happens, Seraphine said, when you read the invoices. By the end of the second week, she had renegotiated the tallow contract, restructured the firewood supply chain, established a new credit arrangement with the Riverport warehouses, and set up a rotating delivery schedule for the border way stations that cut transport costs by a third. The merchants liked her. The guild leaders respected her. The border guards, who had been eating terrible food for years because no one managed the supply contracts for the way station kitchens, practically worshipped her. Cale watched all of this. He watched from the doorways of meeting rooms, from the upper gallery of the guild hall, from the parapet of his keep where he stood in the mornings with his tea and his maps and his scar catching the winter light. He watched Seraphine Marlowe walk into rooms full of men who had been cheating his pack for years and walk out with better terms, fair prices, and signed agreements. He watched her crouch in the kitchen garden to let clover climb into her hands, her golden hair falling over her shoulder, her face soft in a way it never was when other people were looking. He watched, and he said very little, because Cale Ashbourne was a man who understood that some things are better observed than discussed. But his soldiers noticed, Aldrich noticed, the cook noticed, the stable master noticed. Everyone in Iron Ridge, Keep noticed that their alpha, who had never in anyone's memory shown personal interest in any woman, tracked Seraphine Marlowe's movements through the keep like a compass needle finding north. Chapter 5. The First Cloak. The first ambiguity-destroying moment happened 16 days after Seraphine's arrival, on the night of the first real snowstorm. She had been in the guild hall until well past dark, finalizing a salt contract with a coastal trader who had the negotiating style of a weasel and the attention span of a gnat. The deal was done. Favorable terms, reliable delivery, penalty clause for late shipments that Seraphine had insisted on because she had once waited 3 weeks for a late salt delivery and had no intention of ever doing so again, and she was walking back to the keep through the narrow streets of the border town. The snow came suddenly, as border snowstorms do, not a gentle beginning, but a wall of white, horizontal, and blinding, driven by a wind that turned the air into knives. Seraphine, who had been too focused on the salt contract to check the sky before leaving the guild hall, found herself blind and freezing in a street she barely knew. Clover, who had been riding under her skirt hem, her preferred mode of transport in cold weather, pressed against Seraphine's ankle like a warm, furry boot, began thumping. Not the small, conversational thump of contentment, the rapid, staccato thump of alarm. Thump, thump, thump. Seraphine could feel the vibration through the sole of her boot. "I know," she muttered, pressing against a building wall. "I know. I can't see either." The wind screamed. Snow plastered her hair to her face, found every gap in her cloak, bit through her gloves. The broken bond in her chest throbbed. It always throbbed more in the cold, as though the severed thread was trying to pull her back to a warmth that no longer existed. And then a cloak dropped over her shoulders. Not thrown, placed. With precision, with weight, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had practiced moving in darkness and bad weather until it was as natural to him as breathing. The cloak was enormous. Heavy, dark wool lined with fur, still warm from the body that had been wearing it, and it smelled of pine smoke and cold steel and something underneath both of those things that was simply, unmistakably, him. "The guild hall closed an hour ago," Cale said, and his voice was very close, cutting through the wind from directly above her left ear. "I sent Aldrich to walk you back. He said you were still arguing about penalty clauses. I won the argument. I would have been surprised if you hadn't." His hand found her elbow, unerringly, in total darkness and blinding snow, and steadied her. "Can you walk?" "Of course I can walk." "You're shaking." I'm cold. Those are different things. A pause. She could not see his face, but she was absolutely certain that the 16th of an inch smile was happening. Walk with me then, he said. The keep is 4 streets north. I know the way blind. You came out in a blizzard to find me. I came out in a blizzard to check the border watch. Finding you was coincidence. You're not wearing a cloak. I have a thick constitution. You're standing in a blizzard in a shirt. A heavy shirt. Seraphine wanted to argue further, but the wind chose that moment to gust so hard that she staggered, and Cale's hand on her elbow tightened, and she found herself pressed against his side, his very solid, very warm, very shirt-clad side, and his arm came around her shoulders to hold the cloak closed against the wind, and she discovered that the warmth of a large man in a snowstorm is a profoundly convincing argument against further protest. They walked. His arm stayed. Clover, from her position under Seraphine's skirt hem, produced a single, contented thump. Halfway to the keep, Seraphine became aware that Cale was shielding her from the wind with his body. Not obviously, not dramatically, but with the quiet, automatic precision of a man for whom protecting others was as reflexive as breathing. He had positioned himself on her windward side. His arm across her shoulders was angled to block the snow from hitting her face. He was, she realized, freezing. You should take your cloak back, she said. No. You'll get frostbite. I'll get warm by the fire. You are the most stubborn. This, from a woman who argued about penalty clauses for 3 hours in a room with a dying fire. The fire was adequate. The fire was 2 embers and an optimistic stick. She laughed. It was a small, involuntary sound, startled out of her by the sheer absurdity of standing in a blizzard, arguing about fire quality with a man who had given her his cloak and was pretending he wasn't cold. It was the first time she had laughed since the Moonvow Hall, and the sound of it surprised her so much that she stopped walking. Cale stopped too. In the narrow space between snow gusts, she caught a glimpse of his face, snow in his dark hair, ice on his scar, and his blue eyes looking at her with an expression that was not the 16th of an inch smile. It was something larger, something unguarded, something that he shut down almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. He had been looking at her the way Roderick used to look at her, except that Roderick's version of that look had always contained, underneath the warmth, a flicker of something wary, a man admiring a fire that he feared might burn him. Cale's version contained no fear at all. We should keep walking, he said, and his voice was perfectly steady, because Cale Ashbourne could control his voice the way other men controlled their sword arms. They kept walking. His arms stayed around her shoulders. The cloak smelled like pine smoke and cold steel in him, and Seraphine stored that information in the same part of her mind where she kept her most important accounts, the things too valuable to write down, in case someone tried to take them away. Chapter 6: The Rotting Pack. While Seraphine was building trade routes and accepting cloaks from blue-eyed border kings, the Black Pine Pack was dying. Not literally, not yet, but the slow, grinding death of a community that has lost its infrastructure and doesn't realize it until the food runs out. The grain ran short in the 3rd week, exactly as Seraphine had predicted. The river merchants declined to renew the credit arrangement without Seraphine's personal guarantee, exactly as she had warned. The Salt Road closed when the Greymark elders received no renewal request from anyone they recognized, and the medicine supply from the Ashwick herb women ended when the payment was 6 days late. The silver mine wagons stopped coming on the 22nd day. Roderick Blackpine discovered, in the sharp and unforgiving classroom of consequence, that running a pack required more than being tall, handsome, and commanding. It required knowing where the food came from. It required knowing who to pay and when and how much. It required knowing that the cobbler who made boots for the pack's children at cost did so because someone delivered his wife's cheese to market, and that if the cheese deliveries stopped, the boots stopped, and if the boots stopped, children walked barefoot in snow. It required, in short, Seraphine Marlowe. And Seraphine Marlowe was gone. Alara Winterbourne, to her credit, was not entirely useless. She was, in fact, much more capable than Roderick had expected, but her capabilities lay in a direction that made his blood run cold as the winter deepened. She began with the pack's debts. The Black Pine Pack owes 2,000 silver marks to the Heartwood Carriers Guild, she told Roderick on the fourth morning, her voice soft and measured, her pale eyes scanning a ledger that she had produced from her own traveling case. And 1,400 marks to the river merchants, and 800 to the Salt Road Licensing Authority. Total outstanding obligations, 4,200 marks. Roderick stared at her. I didn't know. Your former Luna managed these debts personally. She kept them rolling through a combination of personal guarantees, bartered services, and partial payments timed to cash flow projections. Alara set the ledger down. She was, I must admit, remarkably skilled. Can you do the same? I could, she folded her hands. But it would be simpler to consolidate. Consolidate how? My family's banking house can purchase the outstanding debts from the individual creditors. Instead of owing money to a dozen different people, the Black Pine Pack would owe money to one, the Winterbourne family. She smiled. It was a lovely smile, warm and reassuring and utterly without warmth. It's more efficient. Roderick, who did not understand debt consolidation the way Seraphine would have, and who was too proud to admit this, agreed. This was the second worst decision he had ever made. The first was letting Seraphine walk out of the Moonvow Hall. Because Alara Winterbourne had not come to the Black Pine Pack to be a Luna. She had come to be a locksmith, fitting the tumblers of debt and dependency into place until the entire pack was a door that her family could open at will. Within 2 weeks, the Winterbourne family held every major debt the Black Pine Pack owed. The grain supply was rerouted through Winterbourne warehouses at prices that were technically fair but practically ruinous. The pack's guard rotation was supplemented by Northern soldiers for the pack's protection during this difficult transition, who answered to Alara's family steward, not to Roderick. The pack's treasury key, which Roderick had always carried, was placed in a lockbox to which Alara held the second key as a precaution against the debts. She was absorbing the pack, piece by piece, contract by contract, coin by coin, and she was doing it with such impeccable courtesy, such flawless legal justification, and such a beautifully concerned expression that Roderick did not fully understand what was happening until the day he tried to authorize a firewood purchase and was told by his own steward that the purchase needed Lady Winterbourne's countersignature. She controls the countersignature? Roderick said, and his voice was very quiet. His steward, a nervous man who had replaced the previous steward, who had been loyal to Seraphine and had been reassigned to stable duty by Alara's suggestion, nodded miserably. Roderick sat in his study, which had once been Seraphine's study before it was his, and which still smelled faintly of the lavender sachet she had kept in the desk drawer, and he thought about what he had done. He had traded a woman who loved his pack for a woman who was buying it. Chapter 7. The Stone Keep Accounts. The fourth week brought 2 things to Ironridge Keep, the first snow thaw and the old Black Pine records keeper. His name was Osric, and he was 73 years old, and he had served the Black Pine Pack for 50 of those years as historian, archivist, and keeper of the ancient pack charter. He arrived at Ironridge on a mule, wearing a coat that had been patched so many times it resembled a quilt with aspirations, and carrying a leather case that he held against his chest as though it contained his own heart. Lady Marlowe, he said when Seraphine met him in the keep's great hall, and his old voice cracked on her name. I'm not Lady Marlowe anymore, Osric. You are, because he never filed the severance. Seraphine went very still. What? Osric opened the leather case with trembling fingers and pulled out a sheet of parchment. Old, official, bearing the Black Pine Pack's seal. When an alpha dissolves a mate bond and removes a Luna from her position, the ancient charter requires a formal severance to be recorded by the pack historian and witnessed by 3 elders. The alpha must sign it. The historian must seal it. Until this is done, the former Luna retains her legal standing as a member of the pack. He held up the parchment. It was blank, unsigned, unsealed. He forgot, Osric said. He was so busy with the new Luna and the northern contracts and the spectacle of it all that he forgot to complete the severance. I waited. I prepared the document. He never came to sign it. Seraphine's mind was doing what it always did in moments of crisis, running calculations at a speed that would have made an abacus weep. If the severance was never completed, she was still, legally, under the ancient Black Pine Charter, a member of the pack, not Luna. She had publicly relinquished the title, but a member. With membership came certain rights, including the right to invoke the Charter's most ancient and least used provision, the right of stewardship. Osric, she said slowly, the stewardship clause. The old man's eyes lit up. Chapter 7, Article 3. When the Alpha's governance endangers the pack's survival through debt, famine, or loss of sovereign territory, any full member of the pack may petition for temporary stewardship, provided they can demonstrate both the means and the intent to restore the pack to solvency. And if the Alpha has incurred debts that threaten to transfer pack lands to an outside family, the stewardship petitioner may acquire those debts and present them as evidence of the Alpha's unfitness, triggering a public tribunal. Seraphine looked at the unsigned severance document. She looked at Osric. She looked at the account ledger in her satchel, which contained every debt, every credit, every supply line, and every contact she had built over 6 years. Osric, she said, I need you to tell me the exact amount of every debt the Winterbourne family has purchased from the Black Pine Pack's creditors. Osric told her. Seraphine sat down at her large, beautiful desk in Iron Ridge Keep, opened her account ledger, and began to plan. That night, she was still working when Cale found her. The account room in the East Tower was lit by 4 candles and a fire that had burned low. Seraphine was surrounded by papers, debt records, charter copies, trade route maps, supply calculations. Her golden hair had come loose from its braid and was falling across the ledger she was writing in, and she was so absorbed that she did not hear Cale enter until he set a cup of tea on the desk beside her. She startled. Clover, who had been sleeping under the desk in a nest of discarded draft paper, thumped once. It's past midnight, Cale said. I'm aware. You've been in here since supper. You didn't eat supper. I ate bread. A bread crust does not constitute supper. It constitutes bread, which is a component of supper. He pulled a chair from the corner, set it beside hers, close but not touching, and sat. He looked at the papers spread across the desk, and Seraphine watched his blue eyes move over the numbers, the contracts, the charter language, with the quick, sharp comprehension of a man who might not love commerce but understood power. You're buying the Black Pine debts, he said. I'm considering it. With what funds? My personal savings, my trade commissions from the past 6 years, and, she hesitated, a loan. From? I don't know yet. Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll fund it. Seraphine turned to look at him. They were very close. Close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver in his blue eyes, close enough to smell the pine smoke on his shirt, close enough that when he shifted his weight, his knee brushed hers under the desk. I can't accept that, she said. Why not? Because it would make me beholden to you, and I have spent 6 years being beholden to a man who used my competence and discarded my person, and I will not. It's not a gift, it's an investment. His voice was steady. I invest in the Black Pine debt acquisition. When you take stewardship of the pack, you fold the Black Pine trade routes into the border network, which benefits my territory. I get a return on my investment through reduced trade costs and increased traffic. It's business. Seraphine stared at him. She knew it was not entirely business. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his hand rested on the desk near hers, not touching, but close, as though it was taking conscious effort to maintain the distance. And if I fail? She asked. You won't. You don't know that. I know you argued about salt contract penalty clauses for 3 hours with a dying fire. You don't fail, you outlast. From under the desk, Clover thumped. Then, slowly, she hopped out from her paper nest, crossed the cold stone floor, and climbed onto Cale's boot. He looked down. Clover looked up. She was sitting on his boot like a small, furry auditor, her dark cherry eyes fixed on his face, her nose twitching. She thumped once, not the alarm thump, not the contentment thump, the assessment thump, the thump that said, I am evaluating you, and you should be aware that my standards are high. Cale, slowly and carefully, reached down and offered his hand, palm up. Clover sniffed his fingers. She sniffed for a long time, an unreasonably long time, as though she were conducting a thorough olfactory background check. Then she pressed her nose against his knuckle and hopped off his boot. She approves, Seraphine said, and her voice was softer than she had intended. Does her approval matter? It does to me. They looked at each other across the desk. The fire crackled, the candles flickered, the papers rustled in a draft from the window, and outside, the border wind carried the sound of the river and the distant howl of wolves in the wild country. Take the loan, Cale said. On what terms? Standard interest, 1-year repayment, no personal obligations. He paused. I won't use money to own you, Seraphine. No one will ever use anything to own you again. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded different in his voice, not smaller the way it had sometimes sounded in Roderick's mouth, as though he were trying to contain it, but larger, expansive, like a name that had room to grow. All right, she said. All right. I accept the loan, standard terms, and I want the interest rate in writing before dawn. The 16th of an inch smile became, for the first time, a full smile. It transformed his face. It made him look younger, warmer, and so devastatingly handsome that Seraphine's stomach did something structurally inadvisable. I'll have it drafted, he said, and stood, and his hand brushed her shoulder as he passed, the lightest possible touch, barely there, a whisper of warmth through her wool sleeve. She did not sleep that night, but the reason had changed. Chapter 8. The Salt Road Gambit. Seraphine Marlowe bought the Black Pine Pack's debts in 8 days. It was, by any standard, a masterpiece of financial warfare. She approached each creditor personally, the Heartwood Carriers Guild, the River Merchants, the Salt Road Authority, the medicine suppliers, and purchased their claims on the Black Pine Pack at a discount. The creditors were happy to sell. They had no confidence in Roderick Blackpine's ability to pay. They had no relationship with Alara Winterbourne, and they trusted Seraphine implicitly. The total cost was 3,600 marks, less than the face value of the debts, because Seraphine negotiated discounts with the same ruthless efficiency she applied to grain contracts. Cale's loan covered the bulk of it. Her personal savings covered the rest. When it was done, Seraphine held every debt that Alara Winterbourne had purchased from the original creditors. Because Alara had bought the debts from the same people Seraphine had relationships with, and Seraphine had simply offered to buy the debts from Alara's family at a price slightly higher than what the Winterbournes had paid, making it look like a profitable exit rather than a strategic defeat. The Winterbournes, who thought in terms of interest rates rather than relationships, accepted the buyout. They did not realize until later that they had just sold their entire leverage over the Black Pine Pack to the woman the pack had thrown away. You bought our own debts out from under us? Alara's steward said, staring at the signed transfer documents that Seraphine's courier had delivered to the Black Pine Pack Hall. I bought them from your family, yes, at a profit to your family. Your Lord Father should be pleased. The steward was not pleased. Alara Winterbourne, when she heard, was significantly less pleased. And Lord Aldous Winterbourne, the patriarch of the Northern family, who had spent 3 months engineering the perfect acquisition of a vulnerable pack in its territory, was so profoundly displeased that he broke a quill and had to sit down. But the documents were signed. The law was clear. The debts belonged to Seraphine Marlowe. While the debt acquisition was unfolding, 2 women arrived at Iron Ridge Keep. The first was Marta, the former warehouse keeper of the Black Pine Pack's central grain store. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 40s with calloused hands and a face like a friendly boulder. She had managed the Black Pine granary for 15 years, knew every sack of grain by weight and origin, and had been dismissed by Alara Winterbourne and replaced with a northern-appointed manager who didn't know the difference between winter wheat and spring barley. They fired me, Marta said, standing in Seraphine's account room with her hat in her hands and her chin trembling. After 15 years. The northern woman said they were restructuring warehouse operations, which apparently means replacing everyone who knows anything with people who don't, but who answer to her. How bad is the granary? Seraphine asked. 2 weeks of supplies, maybe less. The northern grain shipments are coming, but they're delayed and the quality is poor. I saw the manifests before they locked me out. Half of it is feed grain, not milling grain. The pack will have bread, but it'll be the kind of bread that breaks teeth. The second arrival was Brenna, a widow from the border town who ran a small caravan operation, 3 wagons, 5 drivers, and a reputation for delivering anything, anywhere, in any weather. She was 50 years old, had 4 arms like a blacksmith, and had been trying to get a trade license from the Iron Ridge Border Authority for 2 years. I heard you're the woman who's reorganizing the border trade, Brenna said, standing in the guild hall with her arms crossed and her gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. I also heard you're the woman the Black Pine Alpha threw out on her ear at the Moon Vow, which makes you either the unluckiest woman in the borderlands or the most interesting. I'm betting on interesting. Seraphine liked her immediately. I need a grain run, Seraphine said. Fast, reliable, and quiet. 40 wagons of good grain from the Riverport warehouses to a staging point on the Black Pine border. Can you do it? 40 wagons? Brenna's eyebrows rose. That's a full winter supply for a medium pack. Yes. When? Before the tribunal. Brenna grinned. It was the grin of a woman who had been waiting her entire life for someone to ask her to do something this ambitious. I'll do it in 12 days, she said, but I want the trade license. Done. Brenna left. Marta stayed, and Seraphine put her to work organizing the grain logistics, purchase orders, quality checks, wagon assignments, delivery schedules. Marta was thrilled. She had not been this useful since being fired, and usefulness was the air she breathed. It's like old times, Marta said, sorting manifests with the speed of a woman who dreamed in inventory counts. Except better. Because this time, the person I'm working for actually knows what she's doing and appreciates it. Seraphine looked up from her ledger. Roderick appreciated your work. Roderick didn't know I existed until the granary was empty. You knew my name on your second day. Marta paused. That's the difference, Lady Marlowe. You see the people who keep things running. He only saw the things. Chapter 9, The Riding Lesson. On the 29th day, Cale took Seraphine to inspect the southern trade route. This was technically a business necessity. The southern route ran through a mountain pass that was critical to the grain shipments Brenna was organizing, and Seraphine needed to see the terrain, the bridge conditions, and the way station capacity. It was also less technically the first time they had been alone together outside the keep since the night of the blizzard cloak. The southern pass was beautiful and terrible, a narrow road cut into the side of a granite gorge with the river roaring 100 feet below and the mountain rising sheer above. The winter sun turned the ice on the rocks into diamonds, and the air was so cold and clean that breathing it felt like drinking water from a glacial stream. Seraphine was a competent rider, but she was not a mountain rider. The border horses were different from the gentle, road-trained animals she had ridden in the Black Pine lowlands. They were sure-footed, opinionated, and alarmingly comfortable with heights. Her horse, a gray mare named Slate, who had the personality of a mildly intoxicated duchess, decided halfway through the pass that the best route was 6 inches from the edge of a 200-foot cliff. Pull her left, Cale said from behind her. I am pulling her left. She is ignoring me. She's testing you. Pull harder. If I pull any harder, I will pull myself off this horse and into the gorge. Cale brought his horse alongside hers. There was barely room for 2 horses abreast on the narrow road, which meant his leg was pressed against hers, his shoulder almost touching hers, and his hand was available to reach over and steady her reins. He did reach over. His hand closed over hers on the reins, large and warm and absolutely steady, and he guided the mare away from the edge with a calm, practiced pressure that the horse immediately respected. She listens to you, Seraphine said, and she was annoyed to discover that her voice was slightly breathless and not from the altitude. She listens to confidence. Horses and wolves are the same. They follow the person who believes they know where they're going. I know where I'm going. I know you do. His hand was still on hers. The reins were steady. The horse was walking calmly. There was no practical reason for his hand to remain. It remained. You can let go, Seraphine said. I could. The horse is fine. The horse is fine. Then why? Because your hand is cold and mine is warm, and I am choosing to interpret this as a practical concern rather than an emotional one. Seraphine turned her head to look at him. He was very close, close enough that she could count the shades of blue in his eyes, close enough to see the way the winter light caught on the fine scar across his cheekbone. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one from the blizzard, the one that contained no fear. Is it a practical concern? She asked. Absolutely. Frostbitten fingers cannot sign contracts, and you have a tribunal to prepare for. That is the most unromantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I am a deeply unromantic man. His thumb moved across the back of her hand. Once. Slowly. Ask anyone. From beneath Seraphine's heavy riding skirt there was a soft, rapid thumping. Thump, thump, thump. Clover had strong opinions about the current situation. Kale looked at Seraphine's skirt. He looked at Seraphine. The full smile appeared again, the one that transformed his entire face and made Seraphine's internal organs rearrange themselves. Your chaperone disapproves, he said. My chaperone approves. That's the approval thump. How many thumps does she have? 7. I have a chart. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, a real laugh, deep and warm, caught off guard by a woman with a rabbit under her skirt and a chart of rabbit thumps. The sound echoed off the granite walls of the gorge and came back to them like a gift. They rode the rest of the pass in silence, but his hand did not leave hers until they reached the valley floor, and when it finally did, she felt its absence like a change in temperature. Chapter 10. The Unwelcome Visitor. On the 33rd day, Roderick Blackpine came to Iron Ridge. He came alone, which was either brave or stupid, riding a horse that was too thin for the border roads and wearing clothes that were too fine for the weather. He looked, Seraphine thought when she saw him from her tower window, like a painting of a hero that had been left in the rain, still beautiful, still technically impressive, but slightly running at the edges. He asked to see her. He was told by Aldrich that Lady Marlowe was in a meeting with the Merchant Guild. He waited in the Great Hall for 2 hours, during which he was offered tea, adequate, bread, good, and the company of 3 border guards who knew exactly who he was, exactly what he had done, and who spent the entire 2 hours playing dice and pretending he did not exist. When Seraphine finally came to the Great Hall, she found Roderick standing by the fire with his hands behind his back and his jaw set in the expression she recognized as his "I am about to do something difficult, and I need you to make it easy for me" face. She had seen this face before negotiations, before elder meetings, before every hard conversation in 6 years of partnership. She had always made it easy for him before. She would not be doing that today. Seraphine. Alpha Blackpine. The formality hit him like a slap. She saw it in the way his gray eyes flinched. If you came to ask me to return, save your breath. If you came to deliver the severance document, I should tell you that I'm aware it was never completed, and I intend to use that. Roderick's face went pale, then red, then pale again, which was a meteorologically impressive sequence of color changes. How did you... Osric. That old man had no right. Osric is the pack historian. Maintaining the charter records is literally his right and his duty. If you'd bothered to talk to him at any point in the last 3 months, instead of being distracted by northern fur and winterborn flattery, you would know that. Seraphine, I didn't come here to fight. Then what did you come here for? He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he used to look at her in the early years when they were young and in love, and he hadn't yet started resenting her for being better at his job than he was. His gray eyes were soft and pained and, damn him, honest. The pack is falling apart, he said. The grain is running out. The northern contracts are strangling us. Ilara's family is... I think they're trying to take our lands. Our people are cold and scared, and they're asking for you. Not me. You. They want to know where Lady Marlowe is, and when she's coming back, and whether she knows that the children don't have boots. Seraphine's chest constricted. The children. The children who had always come to her when they needed things, boots, medicine, a story before bed, someone to listen when they were scared. The children should have boots, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. Come back, Roderick said. Come back and fix it. I'll give you whatever authority you need. Full control of the supplies, the trade routes, everything. Just come back. And Lady Winterbourne? Elara stays. The marriage it's done. But you can be Co-Luna, or Co-Luna. Seraphine's voice could have frozen the river. You want me to come back and do all the work of running your pack while your wife sits in the Luna's chair and her family continues to drain your treasury. You want me to save you and remain subordinate to the woman who replaced me. It's not like that. It is exactly like that. It is, in fact, so precisely like that I am impressed you managed to describe it without realizing what you were describing. Sera? Do not call me that. The old name, the private name, the one he had whispered against her hair in their bed, the one he had called her when they were alone and happy, and the world was small enough to fit between them, hung in the air between them like a ghost. You don't get to use that name anymore, Seraphine said. You gave up that name when you paraded another woman into our hall on our night and told our people that I was being retired to a leaking cottage. You gave it up, Roderick, and you cannot have it back. The doors at the far end of the great hall opened and Cale Ashbourne walked in. He was wearing his border commander's coat, dark leather, gray fur collar, steel-reinforced bracers. He had clearly come from the training yard. There was a fine sheen of sweat on his temple, and his dark hair was pushed back from his face in a way that made the scar on his cheekbone catch the firelight. He looked, Seraphine thought, with a completely unhelpful surge of awareness, like a man who had been carved by a sculptor with a very generous imagination and a deep understanding of shoulder-to-waist ratios. He assessed the scene in approximately 2 seconds. Roderick Blackpine, standing by the fire, tall and handsome and visibly desperate. Seraphine, standing 10 feet away, golden-haired and furious and shaking slightly. The charged, painful air between them. Cale walked to Seraphine's side and stopped. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply stood beside her, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, and looked at Roderick with an expression of calm, complete, and devastating indifference. Roderick looked at Cale. Cale looked at Roderick. The two men were roughly the same height, but the comparison ended there. Roderick was a regional alpha clinging to a pack he was losing. Cale was a border king with an army, a trade network, and the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed to prove his power, because no one had ever seriously questioned it. You must be the former alpha, Cale said. His tone was pleasant, as though he were commenting on the weather. I am the current alpha of the Blackpine pack. For now. Cale turned to Seraphine. The guildmaster has confirmed the grain shipment schedule. Brenna's wagons leave the river port tomorrow. You'll have 40 wagons of good grain at the border staging point in 12 days. Thank you, Seraphine said. You should eat supper tonight, a full supper, not bread. I had bread and cheese. Adding cheese does not make bread into supper. Roderick watched this exchange with the expression of a man watching his own house burn down from across a field, helpless, horrified, and beginning to understand that he had left the stove unattended. Cale was not touching Seraphine. He was not holding her hand, not putting his arm around her, not making any overt claim. He was simply there, solid, warm, calm, and so obviously oriented toward her that the entire room rearranged itself around the two of them like iron filings around a magnet. And Seraphine, for the first time since the Moonvow Hall, looked comfortable. She looked like a woman standing next to someone she trusted, in a place where she was valued, doing work that mattered. Roderick saw all of this. It destroyed him. I should go, he said. Yes, Seraphine agreed. You should. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned back. I loved you, he said. I need you to know that. I loved you, and I was afraid of how much I needed you, and I chose wrong. I know that now. Seraphine looked at him across the hall. Her golden brown eyes were steady. You loved me, she said, but you loved your pride more, and that, Roderick, is why you lost both. He left. The great doors closed behind him. Seraphine stood very still for a long moment, Then her shoulders dropped half an inch, the only outward sign that the encounter had cost her anything, and she exhaled. "Bread and cheese is a perfectly adequate supper," she said to no one in particular. "It is not," Cale said. From beneath her skirt, Clover produced a single, emphatic thump of agreement. Chapter 11. The Northern Reckoning. Alara Winterbourne arrived at Iron Ridge 4 days later, and she did not come alone. She came with her father. Lord Aldous Winterbourne was a tall, thin man with hair the color of old iron and eyes like a ledger. Every number noted, every debt remembered, every opportunity calculated to the last decimal. He wore fine clothes without ostentation, spoke softly, and radiated the particular kind of menace that belongs to people who destroy others using paperwork instead of swords. He also brought 20 Northern soldiers, which was technically a breach of border protocol and practically a statement of intent. Cale met them at the gate. He did not invite them in. He stood in the gateway of Iron Ridge Keep with his arms crossed, his border guard flanking him, and an expression that suggested the Northern soldiers had approximately 30 seconds to explain themselves before they experienced the practical implications of trespassing on a border king's territory. "Lord Winterbourne," Cale said, "your soldiers can make camp outside the walls. Border law does not permit foreign armed forces within Iron Ridge Keep." Lord Winterbourne's thin smile did not waver. "They are an escort, Lord Ashbourne, for my daughter's safety." "Your daughter is safe. The borderlands are my jurisdiction, and I do not lose guests." He paused. "The soldiers stay outside." They stayed outside. Lord Winterbourne entered the keep with Alara and a single steward, and was shown to the hall where Seraphine was waiting. This was the first time Seraphine and Alara had been face to face since the Moonvow Hall. Seraphine had spent the intervening weeks building a trade empire, acquiring debts, organizing grain shipments, and falling reluctantly but thoroughly in love with a border king. Alara had spent the same weeks managing a dying pack, executing her father's acquisition strategy, and slowly discovering that being a tool was lonelier than being a person. They looked at each other across the hall. "Lady Marlowe," Alara said. Her voice was as musical and measured as it had been in the Moonvow Hall, but there were shadows under her pale eyes that had not been there before. "Lady Winterbourne, I understand you've purchased our family's debt holdings on the Blackpine Pack." "I have. At a profit to my family. At a fair price to your family. I don't operate through deception, Lady Winterbourne. I find it inefficient." Alara's jaw tightened. The barb had landed, because her father's entire strategy had been built on deception. The deception of a marriage disguised as an alliance, debts disguised as assistance, absorption disguised as generosity. Lord Winterbourne stepped forward. "Lady Marlowe, my family has invested considerable resources in the Blackpine Pack's recovery. We have supplied grain, soldiers, and administrative support during a time of crisis. The debts you purchased represent a fraction of our total commitment. I propose a discussion about—" "Lord Winterbourne," Seraphine said, "I don't negotiate with men who use their daughters as financial instruments." The hall went silent. Lord Winterbourne's thin smile froze. Alara beside him went very still, but not with anger, with something else, something that looked for one unguarded instant like recognition. "I beg your pardon?" Lord Winterbourne said. "Your daughter was sent to the Blackpine Pack with a betrothal chain, a set of debt contracts, and instructions to convert a marriage into an acquisition. The grain you supplied was feed quality, not milling quality. The soldiers you sent answered to your steward, not to the Alpha. The administrative support involved replacing every pack official who might resist your control with Northern appointees." Seraphine opened her account ledger. "I have the manifests, the contracts, the personnel records, and the correspondence between your steward and your banking house. I obtained them from sources within the Blackpine Pack who were loyal to me, who are still loyal to me, because loyalty is not something you can purchase at a discount." She set the ledger on the table. "You did not invest in the Blackpine Pack, Lord Winterbourne. You were buying it. And now you can't because I own the debts, I hold the trade routes, and your daughter's leverage has evaporated." Lord Winterbourne's face was a study in controlled fury. He was not a man accustomed to being outmaneuvered, and he was even less accustomed to being outmaneuvered by a woman who had been publicly discarded 5 weeks ago. "This matter will be settled at tribunal," he said tightly. "I agree," Seraphine said. "I have already petitioned for one." After the Winterbournes left the hall, Cale found Seraphine in the kitchen garden, sitting on a stone bench with Clover in her lap, staring at nothing. He sat beside her. Not too close. Close enough. "You're going to win," he said. "I know." "Then why do you look like you just swallowed a stone?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because Alara Winterbourne looked at me when I said her father used her as a financial instrument, and she looked relieved, as if someone had finally said out loud what she already knew. That doesn't make her innocent." "No, but it makes her pitiable, and I don't want to pity the woman who took my place. I want to be angry at her. Anger is simpler." Cale considered this. You can be angry at someone and pity them at the same time. It's called being a good person. "I don't feel like a good person. I feel like a woman who is about to destroy a family's acquisition strategy and potentially orphan a pack from its new Luna, all because I was too proud to accept a leaking cottage." "You were too smart to accept a leaking cottage. There's a difference." She looked at him. The winter sun was behind him, catching in his dark hair, lighting the scar on his cheekbone. He was not smiling, not even the 16th of an inch version. He was looking at her with complete, unguarded seriousness. "You are going to walk into that tribunal," he said, "and you are going to save a pack that threw you away. You are going to do it with your own mind, your own work, your own relationships, and your own courage. And when it is done, everyone in that hall, your former alpha, his new wife, her father, the elders, the merchants, every person who watched you walk out of that Moonvow hall and thought you were finished, every single one of them will know that Seraphine Marlowe is the most formidable woman in the Borderlands." His hand was on the bench between them. She put hers on top of it. His fingers curled around hers, warm, steady, certain. "Stay with me," she said. "At the tribunal. I don't need you to fight for me, but I need you beside me." "I was always going to be beside you," he said. "You just hadn't asked." Clover from Seraphine's lap thumped once. The approval thump. The real one. Chapter 12. The Second Flash of White Lightning. The incident happened 3 days before the tribunal, and it remains the single funniest thing that anyone in Iron Ridge Keep has ever witnessed. Lord Winterbourne's steward, a thick-necked man named Garrett who had been left at Iron Ridge to coordinate logistics, but who was actually there to intimidate and obstruct, cornered Seraphine in the Guildhall antechamber while she was reviewing the final tribunal documents. Lady Marlowe. He stepped between her and the door. He was a large man, and he used his size the way large men often do, not through direct physical threat, but through the implicit suggestion that the space he occupied was his, and anyone smaller had better work around him. "Your tribunal petition is ill-advised," he said. "Lord Winterbourne is prepared to offer generous terms for a withdrawal, a payment, a property, a position in the Northern household." "No. You would be wise to consider." "I have considered. The answer is no." Garrett stepped closer. "Lady Marlowe, you are a woman alone in the Borderlands with no pack, no family, and no protection. The tribunal may not go the way you expect. Lord Winterbourne has resources. Step back. And influence and allies who—" "I said step back." He did not step back. He reached for her arm, not to grab, not exactly, but to guide, to steer, to physically move her the way men sometimes move women when they want to emphasize that they are larger and stronger and that this is a conversation they intend to control. His hand was 6 inches from her wrist when Seraphine gathered her heavy wool skirt in one hand and lifted it exactly 8 inches off the ground. Clover came out like a white cannonball. The rabbit had been pressed against Seraphine's ankle for the entire conversation, and the thumping, rapid, furious staccato had been building with each word Garrett spoke. When the skirt lifted, Clover launched. She crossed the 3 feet between Seraphine and Garrett in approximately half a second. She hit his right boot at ankle height with both hind legs, a double-footed rabbit kick delivered with the full force of a prey animal that had spent its entire life developing explosive leg muscles for exactly this kind of emergency departure. The kick itself was not devastating. Clover weighed 4 pounds, but the impact, combined with the sheer cognitive disruption of being attacked by a white rabbit that had apparently materialized from a woman's skirt, caused Garrett to lurch sideways. His boot caught on the leg of a chair. The chair tipped. Garrett grabbed for the table to steady himself and caught the edge of a wooden document tray, which slid, taking with it a large inkwell that upended itself across Garrett's shirt sleeve and a stack of correspondence that scattered across the floor like paper snowflakes. Garrett stood in the antechamber with ink running down his arm, papers at his feet, a overturned chair behind him, and a small white rabbit sitting in front of him, thumping one hind foot against the stone floor with the slow, measured cadence of a creature that was thoroughly satisfied with its work. In the doorway, 2 Guildhall clerks and a border guard, who had been passing in the corridor, stood frozen in various states of astonishment and barely contained hilarity. "What?" Garrett sputtered. "What is that?" "That," Seraphine said, gathering Clover up and tucking her back into the safe, warm space beneath her skirt, "is my associate. She has strong opinions about people who crowd her workspace." Garrett looked at the ink on his arm. He looked at the papers on the floor. He looked at the border guard, who was biting his lip so hard it had gone white. "Lord Winterbourne will hear about this," he said, which was the verbal equivalent of a man trying to reassemble his dignity out of wreckage. "I do hope so," Seraphine said pleasantly. "I hear he enjoys a good story." Garrett left. The border guard waited until he was out of earshot, then doubled over laughing. The story was all over the keep by sundown, and by the following morning, the kitchen staff were leaving extra cabbage leaves outside Seraphine's door. Chapter 13. The Night Before the Tribunal. The night before the tribunal, Seraphine could not sleep. She stood at the window of her tower room and looked out at the border river, silver in the moonlight, and thought about everything she was about to do. She was about to walk into a room full of people who had watched her be humiliated and demand that they acknowledge her authority. She was about to challenge the man she had loved, outmaneuver the woman who had replaced her, and dismantle the strategy of a family that was older and richer and more powerful than she would ever be. She was terrified. Not of losing. She had done the math. The law was on her side. The evidence was overwhelming. She was terrified of winning, because winning meant going back. Winning meant returning to the Blackpine Pack, to the halls and hearths and faces of the people who had watched her be set aside and said nothing. Winning meant being responsible again for people who had not fought for her. There was a knock at her door. "It's me," Cale said from the other side. She opened the door. He was standing in the corridor in a dark shirt, his hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. He looked, for the first time since she had met him, uncertain. "I saw your candle from the yard," he said. "You should be sleeping." "I am aware of what I should be doing." "May I come in?" She stepped back. He entered. The room was small with both of them in it. Small in a way that made the air feel charged, as though the space between their bodies was conducting something that neither of them had named. He stood by the window. She stood by the desk. Clover was asleep in a basket by the fire, a small white comma of fur and contentment. "You're afraid," Cale said. "I am not." "Seraphine." She stopped. He never used her name as a weapon. He used it like a key, gently, precisely, to open something she was trying to keep locked. "I'm afraid of going back," she said. "I'm afraid of being needed by people who didn't need me enough to keep me." "They needed you. They just didn't know it until you were gone." "That's the same thing as not needing me." "No, it's not." He crossed the room. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to step back, to refuse the closing distance. She did not step back. It's the difference between a man who doesn't know what air is and a man who doesn't breathe. One is ignorant. The other is dead. He stopped in front of her. Close. Very close. Close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his body. Close enough that his breath stirred the loose strands of her golden hair. "Your pack is suffocating without you," he said. "You are the air. You have always been the air, and tomorrow you are going to walk into that hall and remind every person in it what it feels like to breathe." She looked up at him. He was looking down at her with such focus, such intensity, such barely contained want that the air between them felt like it was burning. "And after the tribunal," she asked, "if I go back to the Black Pine Pack, if I take stewardship, I'll be there and you'll be here. I'll be wherever you need me to be." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." His hand came up slowly, and his fingers brushed her jaw, a touch so light it was barely there, so careful it was almost reverent. "I will not make demands of you, Seraphine. Not tonight, not ever. You have had enough of men who demand things." "What if I want you to demand something?" The question fell between them like a lit match. Cale's blue eyes darkened. His fingers, still against her jaw, trembled. The first time she had ever seen him shake, and the knowledge that her words had caused it made her feel powerful in a way that had nothing to do with debts or trade routes or pack politics. "Then I would demand," he said, his voice low and rough, "that you eat a full supper every day, including vegetables, and that you stop staying up past midnight with your account ledger, and that you—" "Cale. Let me stand next to you, not behind you, not in front of you, next to you, for as long as you'll have me." The fire crackled. Clover stirred in her basket, thumped once, the soft, sleepy thump that meant all was well in the world, and resettled. Seraphine lifted her hand and placed it flat against Cale's chest. His heartbeat was rapid beneath her palm, rapid, strong, and completely at odds with his controlled exterior. He was as terrified as she was, she realized. He was the border wolf king, commander of armies and master of trade routes, and he was standing in a tower room with his heart hammering because a golden-haired woman with a rabbit and a ledger had put her hand on his chest. "Next to me," she said. "Yes. Starting tomorrow. Starting now. Starting always. Starting every day from now until the borderlands crumble into the sea." She almost laughed. That was romantic. "I told you, deeply unromantic man. The most unromantic declaration I have ever received. I can do worse. Would you like to hear my opinions on grain tariffs?" She did laugh then, a real, full laugh that lit up her face and made the room warmer, and his hand slid from her jaw into her hair, gentle and reverent and shaking, and she leaned into his touch, and they stood there in the candlelight with the moonlit river outside the window and the sleeping rabbit by the fire, and an entire future balanced on the edge of tomorrow. Chapter 14, The Tribunal. The tribunal was held in the great hall of the Black Pine Pack's ancestral keep, a vast, cold, stone-vaulted room with pillars carved like pine trees, and a dais at the far end where the Alpha's chair sat under a banner of silver and black. Everyone was there. Roderick Blackpine sat in the Alpha's chair and he looked terrible. Not in appearance, he was still devastatingly handsome because genetics are not subject to political consequences, but in demeanor. He was thin. His gray eyes were shadowed. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were not steady. He looked like a man who had not slept well in weeks, which was accurate because he had spent the last week discovering the full scope of the Winterborn acquisition and understanding, with mounting horror, that he had voluntarily married his pack into a trap. Alara Winterborn sat beside him in the Luna's chair, and she looked composed. Her auburn hair was immaculate. Her gown was immaculate. Her expression was immaculate. She was, to all appearances, a picture of confident authority. But Seraphine, who had spent 6 years reading people's faces across negotiation tables, saw the tension in Alara's jaw and the way her fingers were locked together in her lap, not folded, locked, the way people hold themselves together when they are afraid of what will happen if they let go. Lord Winterborn sat in the honored guest's chair, flanked by his steward Garrett, whose sleeve still had a faint ink stain, and a lawyer whose expression suggested he had been promised an easy victory and was beginning to suspect he had been lied to. The 7 elders of the Black Pine Pack sat along one wall. Elder Marin, the oldest, caught Seraphine's eye as she entered the hall and gave her a nod so small it could have been a twitch. But it was not a twitch. The Merchant Guild representatives sat along the other wall. The Heartwood Carriers Guild Master, the River Merchants Factor, the Salt Road Commissioner, the Herb Women's spokeswoman. They had come because Seraphine had asked them to come, and because every one of them owed their best contracts to a golden-haired woman who actually read invoices. Brenna sat with the merchants, her gray hair pulled back, her arms crossed, her face set in the expression of a woman who had driven 40 wagons of grain through mountain passes in winter weather and was frankly looking forward to watching the bureaucrats try to match that. Marta sat beside Brenna, clutching a ledger of grain inventories and looking like she might vomit, but also like she might punch someone, and she had not yet decided which. Osric the historian sat in his designated corner with his leather case and his quilt coat and his 73 years of institutional memory, looking like a man who had been waiting for this day for a very long time. And Cale Ashbourne sat at the side of the hall, in a chair that had been placed slightly apart from the others, not on the dais, not with the merchants, not with the elders, but in a position that gave him a clear line of sight to Seraphine and, not coincidentally, to every door in the room. He was wearing his border commander's coat, and his expression was the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty about what he would do if anyone in this room made a wrong move. Seraphine entered last. She walked through the great doors of the hall in a gown of deep gold wool, not black pine colors, not Winterbourne colors, but her own, with her golden hair loose over her shoulders and her account ledger in her hand and Clover invisible under the heavy folds of her skirt. She walked down the center of the hall, past the elders, past the merchants, past Roderick and Alara and Lord Winterbourne, and she stopped at the foot of the dais. She did not look at Roderick, she looked at the elders. "I am Seraphine Marlowe," she said, and her voice carried the way voices carry in stone halls, clean, clear, and impossible to ignore. "I am a member of the Black Pine Pack by formal bond, which has never been legally dissolved. I am here to invoke the Stewardship Clause of the Black Pine Pack Charter, Chapter 7, Article 3, on the grounds that the current Alpha's governance has endangered the Pack's survival through debt, famine, and the imminent loss of sovereign territory." The hall erupted. Not literally, no one screamed or threw furniture, but the quality of the silence changed. It went from attentive to electric. Every elder leaned forward, every merchant straightened. Lord Winterbourne's lawyer began writing furiously. Roderick gripped the arms of his chair. "You have no standing," Lord Winterbourne began. "I have full standing." Seraphine opened her ledger. "Osric, please confirm for the tribunal that Alpha Blackpine never completed the formal severance of my bond or my membership." Osric stood, opened his leather case, and held up the blank severance document. The severance was prepared on the night of the moon vow ceremony. It was never signed by Alpha Blackpine. It was never sealed by the Pack historian. Under the charter, Lady Marlowe remains a full member of the Blackpine Pack. Roderick's face went white. He looked at the unsigned document, and Seraphine watched him realize, watched the understanding cross his face like a shadow, that his own carelessness, his own distraction, his own failure to complete a single piece of paperwork had given the woman he had discarded the legal right to challenge him. "That is an administrative oversight," Lord Winterbourne's lawyer said. "It is a legal reality," Seraphine said, "and here is why the stewardship clause applies." She laid out her case the way she laid out trade negotiations, clearly, precisely, devastatingly. The debts, the grain crisis, the salt road closure, the medicine shortage, the silver mine default, the northern soldiers stationed in a pack that had not requested them, the northern appointed officials who had replaced loyal pack members, the feed quality grain shipped at milling grain prices, the treasury lockbox with 2 keys, one of which was held by a woman whose family was systematically stripping the pack's assets. She presented manifests, contracts, correspondence between Lord Winterbourne's banking house and his steward, letters from northern officials that discussed the Black Pine Pack not as an ally but as an acquisition target and a territory in transition. She presented the debt transfer documents, the legal proof that she now held every debt the Winterbourne family had purchased. "The Black Pine Pack owes 4,200 marks," she said. "It owes them to me. I am not here to collect. I am here to forgive these debts in exchange for stewardship, because the purpose of stewardship is not profit, it is survival." Lord Winterbourne's lawyer was no longer writing. He was staring at the documents with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on was never solid. These transfers are legally binding, signed by Lord Winterbourne's own financial officers, checked by the Merchant Guild's independent auditors, sealed by the Border Trade Authority under Lord Ashbourne's jurisdiction. She paused. You are welcome to examine them. He examined them. He examined them for a long time. When he looked up, his face told Lord Winterbourne everything. The transfers are valid, he said. Lord Winterbourne stood. His composure was cracking, not dramatically, but in the small ways that composure cracks in men who have always controlled every room they entered. A tightening of the jaw, a flattening of the eyes, a voice that was a shade too controlled. This tribunal has no authority to dissolve a marriage alliance or to interfere with interpact trade agreements. I am not dissolving your daughter's marriage, Seraphine said. Alpha Blackpine chose Lady Winterbourne. That choice stands. But the trade agreements your family imposed on this pack were not agreements. They were tools of acquisition. And the stewardship clause exists precisely to protect a pack from being absorbed by an outside force through debt manipulation. She turned to the elders. I ask the Council of Elders to rule on my petition. I have demonstrated the debts. I have demonstrated the threat. I have demonstrated my means. 40 wagons of good grain are currently at the border staging point, ready to enter Blackpine territory. Winter fuel, medicine, and craft supplies follow within the week. I am prepared to take stewardship of this pack, forgive its debts, restore its supply lines, and reopen its trade routes. She paused. All I need is your vote. Elder Marin stood. She was 81 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and she had the moral authority of a mountain. I have a question, she said. Yes, Elder. If we grant stewardship, what happens to Alpha Blackpine? Seraphine looked at Roderick. He was staring at her. His gray eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been the reflection of the firelight, or might have been the terrible luminous clarity of a man who was seeing for the first time the full shape of what he had lost. Alpha Blackpine retains his membership in the pack, Seraphine said. He retains his home. He retains his wolf. But the stewardship clause suspends his governance authority until the pack is restored to stability. He will be assigned duties appropriate to his abilities. He can work. He can serve. He can rebuild trust. She paused. He cannot lead, not until he learns what leadership actually costs. Roderick flinched as though she had struck him, but he did not protest. He sat in his Alpha's chair and he looked at the woman he had thrown away, and for the first time in his life he did not try to argue or charm or command his way out of a situation. He simply nodded. And the Winterbourne family's involvement? Elder Marin asked. The Winterbourne family's debts are forgiven. Their trade contracts are voided. Their soldiers leave Blackpine territory by sunrise. Their appointed officials are replaced by the original pack members who were dismissed. Seraphine looked at Lord Winterbourne. Your family entered this pack through a marriage. You may maintain the marriage, but the acquisition is over. And because your escort entered sovereign territory under false commercial papers, Elder Marin added, the Winterbourne Guard will unload and inventory every sealed weapons chest before they leave. Lord Winterbourne will stand in the yard and sign each count himself. By noon, the Northern Lord who had arrived wrapped in white fox and certainty would be ankle-deep in black slush beside a wagon line, holding a clipboard with numb fingers, while border guards opened chest after chest of illegal blades. It was not blood. It was worse for a man like him. It was public labor, public mud, and public proof that his beautiful invasion had become paperwork in the snow. Lord Winterbourne's thin face was rigid. You will regret this. I regret many things, Lord Winterbourne. This will not be one of them. And then, because fate has a sense of timing that borders on theatrical, the moment broke. Roderick, in one last reflexive assertion of the authority he was losing, stood from his chair and let his Alpha presence roll through the hall. It was not an attack. It was instinct, the desperate, cornered instinct of a wolf who feels his territory slipping away. The pressure wave hit every person in the room, a heavy, suffocating weight of dominance that pushed at the chest and thickened the air. Seraphine felt it. She braced against it. She did not buckle. But under her skirt, Clover felt it too. The thumping started. Soft at first, then faster, then furious. Thump, 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 thump. The sound echoed off the stone floor. In the pressured silence of the hall, it was clearly audible, a rapid, insistent percussion that seemed to come from the base of the dais, from the ground, from the very foundations of the building. Every head turned. Lord Winterbourne's lawyer looked at the floor. Garrett, the steward, looked at the floor. Elder Marin looked at Seraphine's skirt with narrowed eyes. Roderick stared, his alpha presence faltering in confusion. Thump, 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 hump. What is that sound? Lord Winterbourne demanded. Seraphine looked down at her skirt. She looked at the tribunal. She looked at Roderick, who was still standing, still radiating dominance, still trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through his fingers. She gathered her skirt in one hand. She lifted the hem 8 inches off the stone floor. Clover exploded outward. The rabbit, small, white, furious, and absolutely done with the pressure in the air, burst from beneath Seraphine's skirt with the trajectory of a startled snowball. She hit the dais step, slipped on the polished stone, bounced sideways, and crashed into the wooden document tray that held the tribunal's official seal, inkstand, and signing quills. The tray tipped. The seal rolled. The inkstand, full because Osric had filled it that morning, flipped end over end and landed upside down on the exact spot where Roderick had been resting his hand on the arm of the Alpha's chair. Black ink fountained across the chair arm, across Roderick's sleeve, and across the front of his ceremonial coat. Clover, having achieved maximum chaos by accident and wanting no further part in public law, froze in the middle of the dais. Her dark cherry eyes were wide. Her nose twitched rapidly. Her small white body trembled with the offended dignity of a rabbit that had found the entire room too loud, too tense, and too alpha. The hall was frozen. Then Elder Marin, 81 years old, 5 feet tall, moral authority of a mountain, began to laugh. Then Elder Marin, 81 years old, 5 feet tall, moral authority of a mountain, began to laugh. It started as a wheeze, progressed to a cackle, and became the kind of full-bodied laughter that makes old women clutch their ribs. Brenna joined in, then Marta, then the Heartwood Guildmaster, then the border guards, then the clerks, then one by one the elders, until the entire hall was ringing with laughter, and Roderick Blackpine was standing on his dais in an ink-splattered coat, while a terrified white rabbit tried to hide behind Seraphine's hem. Cale, from his chair at the side of the hall, watched Seraphine. He was not laughing, he was smiling. Not the 16th of an inch smile, not the full smile, but something else entirely. Something private. Something that he would probably deny later if anyone asked. He was looking at her the way a man looks at the person he is going to spend the rest of his life next to. The person who brought a rabbit to a tribunal and somehow made it the most memorable moment of judicial history. Seraphine bent down and picked Clover up. The rabbit tucked herself against Seraphine's chest and thumped once. Satisfied, definitive, done. "I apologize for the interruption," Seraphine said to the tribunal, her voice perfectly steady despite the fact that her lips were twitching. "My rabbit objects to loud men and poor governance." Elder Marin wiped her eyes. "The associate's feelings are noted." She straightened, still wheezing slightly. "The council will vote. All in favor of granting stewardship to Seraphine Marlowe?" 7 hands rose. Every elder, unanimous. "Stewardship is granted," Elder Marin said. "Lady Marlowe, the Blackpine Pack is yours." Chapter 15. The Homecoming. Seraphine Marlowe returned to the Blackpine Pack on the morning after the tribunal, and she did not return empty-handed. Brenna's 40 wagons of grain rolled through the pack gates at first light, driven by border teamsters and guarded by Iron Ridge riders. Behind the grain came wagons of firewood, tallow, salt, and medical supplies. Behind those came Marta, who walked into the granary she had managed for 15 years, looked at the feed-quality northern grain that had been stored in her absence, said, "Absolutely not," and began organizing the replacement with the focused intensity of a woman who had been personally insulted by substandard wheat. The pack watched from their doorways and windows as the wagons rolled in. They watched in silence at first, the wary, uncertain silence of people who have been let down too many times to trust easily. Then an old woman in the baker's row stepped out of her house, looked at the grain wagon, looked at Seraphine, and said, "Is that milling grain?" "Yes." "Good quality?" "I inspected it personally." "River Valley or mountain?" "River Valley, this year's harvest, dry stored in the port warehouses since October." The old woman nodded. Then she did something that broke the silence of the entire street. She applauded. A single, sharp clap that echoed off the stone buildings, followed by another and another. The baker's wife joined, then the cobbler's apprentice, then the families in the doorways, one by one, hands coming together in the cold morning air, until the sound rolled up the street like thunder. Seraphine stood in the center of it, golden-haired and straight-backed, with a rabbit under her skirt and a wolf in her chest and tears that she absolutely refused to let fall, and she thought, This is what power is for. The northern soldiers left by midday. Their departure was not graceful. Lord Winterbourne's steward Garrett, who was supervising the withdrawal, managed to trip over a grain sack that Marta had deliberately placed in the narrowest part of the gate corridor. He went down on one knee, his sword caught on his cloak, and his belt pouch split open, sending a cascade of copper coins across the cobblestones. 3 children, who had been watching the departure with the frank, unfiltered delight that children take in watching adults look foolish, scrambled to collect the coins and presented them back to Garrett with angelic smiles. "Thank you for visiting," the eldest child said. She was 7 years old and had clearly been coached. "Please don't come back." Garrett turned crimson, retrieved his coins, and left without further incident. Lord Winterbourne himself departed on horseback, his lawyer beside him, his thin face set in an expression that promised retribution. Seraphine watched him go from the parapet of the keep wall. "He'll be back," she said. "Eventually," Cale agreed. He was standing beside her, always beside her now, as naturally as breathing. But not soon. His leverage is gone, his debts are forgiven, his soldiers are withdrawn. The most he can do is complain to other northern families that a woman with a rabbit outmaneuvered him, and I don't think his pride will allow that. "And Alara?" They both looked down into the courtyard, where Alara Winterbourne was standing alone. She had not left with her father. She was standing by the well in the center of the courtyard, her auburn hair escaping its careful coil for the first time since Seraphine had known her, her midnight blue gown creased and travel-stained, her hands at her sides. She looked, stripped of her composure and her family's backing, very young. Seraphine went down to the courtyard. They stood on opposite sides of the well, and for a long moment, neither spoke. "Your father is gone," Seraphine said. "Yes." "You stayed." "The marriage is valid. Roderick is my husband. Whatever else has changed, that has not." Alara's voice was steady, but the shadows under her eyes were deep. "Unless you intend to dissolve it." "I don't dissolve marriages, I dissolve bad contracts. Your father's contracts were bad. Your marriage is your own business." Alara looked at her. "You hate me." "I don't hate you. I hate what you were sent here to do. But I watched you in the tribunal, and I don't think you enjoyed doing it." Something cracked in Alara's composure. A small, controlled fracture, like a line appearing in ice. "I was trained," she said, "from the time I was 12. Ledgers, contracts, debt structures, acquisition strategies. My father taught me to see every relationship as a transaction and every weakness as a purchase opportunity. I was very good at it." "You were excellent at it." "I didn't want to be." The words came out fast, as though she had been holding them for a long time. I wanted to be good at something that didn't require making people vulnerable. But my father said that was soft. He said softness was a luxury our family couldn't afford." Seraphine studied the woman who had replaced her. She saw the precision, the training, the cold competence. She also saw the exhaustion underneath it. The weariness of a person who had spent her entire life performing a role that someone else had written. "You are good at accounts," Seraphine said. "You are good at reading contracts, managing numbers, seeing patterns. Those are valuable skills. They do not have to be weapons." "What else can they be?" "Tools. For building something instead of taking something apart." She paused. "The pack needs a treasury manager. Someone who understands debt, credit, and financial structures. someone who can prevent the kind of crisis your father's family exploited. It would not be a glamorous position. It would not be the Luna's chair, but it would be useful, and it would be yours. Alara stared at her. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a choice. You can go back to your father and be his instrument again, or you can stay here and be something else. The crack in Alara's composure widened. Her pale eyes filled, not quite with tears, but with the precursor to tears. The bright, painful pressure that comes when a person is offered something they did not expect and are not sure they deserve. I'll stay, she said. Seraphine nodded. Good. Your first task is to audit the northern grain that was delivered during your tenure. Marta says half of it is feed quality. I want to know exactly how much we were overcharged, because I intend to send the invoice to your father. Despite everything, despite the wreckage of her plans, the humiliation of the tribunal, the collapse of her family's strategy, Alara Winterbourne laughed. It was a small, startled, genuine sound, and it made her look, for the first time, like a woman rather than a strategy. I deserved that, she said. You did. But you also deserved a choice, and now you have one. Seraphine extended her hand. Welcome to the Black Pine Pack, Lady Winterbourne, the real one. Alara took her hand. Chapter 16. The Reckoning of the Alpha. Roderick Blackpine's punishment was not dramatic. There was no public flogging, no chains, no exile. Seraphine had always understood better than Roderick himself, that the most devastating thing you could do to a proud man was not to hurt him, but to make him useful. He was assigned duties, humble ones. He carried grain sacks from the wagons to the granary, heavy, dirty, back-breaking work that he had never done in his life because he was an alpha. And alphas gave orders about grain sacks rather than carrying them. He repaired the eastern border cottage, the one with the leaking roof, the one he had tried to banish Seraphine to, under the supervision of the pack's carpenter, who was a woman named Dag who had once arm-wrestled a bear and who took visible pleasure in correcting Roderick's shoddy roof work. That nail is crooked, Dag said. It's functional. It's crooked. Pull it out and do it again. Lady Marlowe lives in a keep with straight nails. The least you can do is provide the same standard for the cottage. Roderick pulled the nail and did it again. He did not complain. He had lost the right to complain in the Moonvow Hall, and he knew it. He saw Seraphine every day. She was everywhere, in the granary checking stores, in the guild hall negotiating contracts, in the elders' meeting room discussing winter preparations, in the kitchen garden where Clover had established a small but resolute empire among the remaining cabbage plants. She was golden-haired and efficient and calm, and she was building something extraordinary out of the wreckage he had created. And every day the distance between them grew, because he could see her, and she no longer looked at him. On the 5th day of his penance, he was stacking firewood in the courtyard when Seraphine walked past with Kale. They were discussing trade route adjustments, the kind of practical, detailed conversation that Roderick had always found tedious and that Seraphine made sound like poetry. Kale was listening to her the way Roderick had never listened, with full attention, genuine interest, and the quiet, absolute focus of a man who understood that the woman beside him was extraordinary and who had no intention of taking that for granted. Seraphine said something about Salt Road tariff structures, and Kale said something back that made her laugh, a real laugh, bright and warm, the laugh that Roderick had not heard in years because he had stopped making her laugh long before he stopped being her mate. And then Kale's hand settled on the small of her back as they walked through a doorway, an easy, natural touch, the touch of a man who was allowed to touch and who touched not to claim but to connect. And Seraphine leaned into it, just slightly, just for a moment, a movement so small that no one but Roderick would have noticed. But Roderick noticed. He stood in the courtyard with an armload of firewood and watched the woman he had loved walk away with a man who was better than him in every way that mattered, and the wood was heavy, and the air was cold, and the fire in his chest was the kind that burned without warmth. He had loved her. He had loved her, and he had been afraid of her strength. And he had chosen a woman who came wrapped in the illusion of softness and the reality of steel. And now the woman he had loved was laughing in another man's keep and leaning into another man's hand and building an empire out of the rubble of his mistakes. He put the firewood down. He drove the nails straight. He did not complain. It was, Seraphine noted with a detachment that was mostly genuine, a start. Chapter 17. The Moonbound Queen. The coronation, if it could be called a coronation, technically it was a confirmation of stewardship, but everyone, including the person who drafted the official documents, understood that it was a coronation, took place on the winter solstice in the Moonvow Hall where everything had begun. The hall looked different. Seraphine had not changed the architecture. The stone pillars still rose like pine trees. The moonstone dais still gleamed at the far end. But the hall was warm because the firewood supply was restored. It was bright because new candles filled every bracket. It was full because the pack had come. Every family, every elder, every child, every person who had watched Seraphine walk out of this hall 6 weeks ago with her spine straight and her future unknown. They had come to watch her walk back in. The merchants were there, the Heartwood Guildmaster, the River Factor, the Salt Road Commissioner, all of them people who had done business with Seraphine for years and who had come to see her formally recognized. Brenna was there, wearing a new coat and the trade license that Seraphine had promised her, looking like a woman who had driven 40 wagons through a mountain pass and would do it again tomorrow if asked. Marta was there, standing near the granary delegation, clutching a grain manifest that showed the stores at full capacity for the first time in 3 months. Osric was there, in his quilt coat, holding the charter as though it were a holy relic, which to him it was. Alara was there. She sat in the second row, not the first, in a plain woolen gown instead of midnight blue velvet. She looked composed, but differently composed. Not the composure of a woman maintaining a mask, but the composure of a woman who was discovering, tentatively, what her face looked like without one. She was holding a ledger, the treasury audit she had completed at Seraphine's request, and when Seraphine's eyes found her, she gave a small nod that contained, if you were looking for it, something that might have been gratitude. Roderick was there. He stood at the back of the hall, near the doors. He was wearing a plain coat, no ceremonial silver, no Alpha's insignia. He had come not because he was required to, but because, for the first time in his life, he wanted to be present for something that was not about him. And Cale was there. He stood at the front of the hall, near the dais, but not on it. He was wearing his commander's coat, the dark leather and gray fur that had become, for Seraphine, the most comforting sight in the world. His blue eyes were on her as she walked the length of the hall, and his face held nothing, no mask, no composure, no strategic neutrality. Just warmth. Pure, unguarded, unflinching warmth. Seraphine walked to the dais. Elder Marin met her there, holding the old silver circlet of the Black Pine Pack's ruling authority, the same circlet that had been worn by every leader since the pack's founding, simple and ancient and heavy with history. Seraphine Marlowe, Elder Marin said, and her old voice carried to every corner of the hall. You left this pack with nothing but your ledger, your savings, and your word. You returned with grain for our granary, medicine for our sick, fuel for our fires, and hope for our future. You purchased our debts and forgave them. You uncovered the threat to our lands and defeated it. You did all of this not with armies or wealth or family name, but with the intelligence, the relationships, and the relentless competence that this pack took for granted and very nearly lost. The hall was silent. Absolutely, profoundly silent. I ask whether this woman, who has earned the loyalty of every trade partner, the respect of the Border Wolf King, the gratitude of Black Pine, the trust of Iron Ridge, and the very loud approval of a particular rabbit, should be recognized not as a temporary steward, but as what she has already become on every road, in every granary, and at every bargaining table, a queen. She held up the circlet. I ask whether this woman, who has earned the loyalty of every trade partner, the respect of the Border King, the gratitude of her people, and the trust of a very particular rabbit, should be recognized not as a steward, but as what she has always been, a queen. The response was not a vote, it was a roar. The pack rose to its feet. The merchants rose. The border guards rose. Brenna stamped her boots on the stone floor so hard that the sound echoed like thunder. Marta clapped until her calloused hands were red. The children in the front row cheered with the unself-conscious delight of people who did not understand politics, but understood that the nice lady who remembered their names was in charge now, and things were going to be better. Elder Marin placed the circlet on Seraphine's golden hair, and Seraphine closed her eyes for 1 second, one single second of pure, private feeling, and then opened them. "I accept," she said. "Not because I wanted this, but because this pack deserves someone who will choose its people over her pride. I will rebuild what was broken. I will protect what is ours, and I will never, ever let anyone use our vulnerabilities against us again." She turned to face the hall, and the hall looked back at her, and what they saw was not a discarded Luna or a scorned woman or a convenient administrator. They saw a queen. The moonbound queen of Blackpine, Iron Ridge, and the Eastern Trade Roads. Under her skirt, Clover thumped once, soft, certain, final. The reception after the coronation was chaotic and joyous and involved a great deal of good milling quality bread, the first the pack had tasted in weeks. Marta had personally supervised the baking, and she stood near the bread table with an expression of fierce maternal pride, as though each loaf were a child she had raised from dough. Brenna cornered the Heartwood Guildmaster and negotiated a reduced transport rate for spring deliveries, while he was distracted by Honeymead. The Guildmaster agreed to terms he would later describe as generous and possibly the result of mild inebriation. But by then the contract was signed. Osric sat in his corner and cried quietly into his quilt coat, which was the happiest Seraphine had ever seen him. One of the younger border guards, a sandy-haired man named Finn, who had been assigned to Seraphine's escort during the grain runs, brought her a cup of mead and said with the earnest directness of a 23-year-old who had been thoroughly smitten for weeks, "My lady, if there is ever anything you need, anything at all, I am entirely at your service." "Thank you, Finn." "Anything, day or night, rain or shine, I mean that quite seriously." "I know you do." Kale, who had appeared at Seraphine's shoulder with the silent, lethal efficiency of a man who had a sixth sense for when younger men were being too attentive to the woman beside him, said, "Finn." "My lord?" "The Eastern Watchtower needs a night patrol." "Now, my lord." "Now, Finn." Finn left, looking slightly dazed but fundamentally unharmed. Seraphine looked at Kale. Kale looked at his mead. "That was unnecessary," she said. "The Eastern Watchtower is chronically understaffed." "You're jealous." "I am strategically allocating personnel." "You are jealous, and you are bad at hiding it." "I am the Border Wolf King. I do not get jealous. I get territorial." He paused. "There is a significant difference." "Is there?" "Jealousy is irrational. Territoriality is biological." "And which biological impulse prompted you to send a 23-year-old to a watchtower in the middle of winter?" "The one that responds to men who say day or night, rain or shine to women who are not their mates." He took a sip of mead. "I can recall him if you found his attention flattering." "I found his attention sweet." "Sweet." The word came out as though it had personally offended him. "I will endeavor to be sweet. Would you like me to bring you mead and make earnest declarations? I can attempt an expression of youthful devotion. I should warn you, my face may not cooperate." Seraphine laughed. She laughed so hard she had to put down her own cup. And when she straightened, Kale was looking at her with that expression, the one that was not the 16th of an inch smile or the full smile, but something else, something that he had stopped trying to hide. "Come outside," she said. They went to the courtyard. It was cold and clear, and the moon was full, an enormous luminous moon that turned the snow on the mountains into silver and made the world look like it had been painted in light. They stood side by side, the way they had been standing for weeks, always side by side, always close enough to touch, always just barely not touching. "I have something to ask you," Seraphine said. "Ask." "I am the queen of the Blackpine Pack. My territory borders yours. Our trade routes are interconnected. Our supply chains are integrated. From a strategic perspective, an alliance between our packs would be mutually beneficial." "From a strategic perspective," Kale repeated. "Yes, and from a personal perspective," she turned to face him, "I would very much like to stop pretending that I am not in love with you." The moonlight caught his face, the scar, the blue eyes, the jaw, the expression that was no longer guarded, no longer measured, no longer anything other than what it was. A man looking at the woman he loved with the relieved, wondering joy of someone who had been waiting for permission to stop holding his breath. "I was not pretending," he said. "You were a little bit pretending. I was strategically managing my emotions." "You were pretending." "I was. All right, I was pretending." He took her hand. Both hands. He held them the way he had held them on the mountain pass. Warm, steady, certain. "I have been pretending since the moment I saw you in that way station, covered in mud, clutching an account ledger, with a rabbit in your cloak and your spine straighter than my sword. I have been pretending through every meeting, every trade negotiation, every blizzard cloak and mountain pass and midnight account session. I have been pretending because you had just been betrayed by a man who used love as leverage, and I would rather have pretended for the rest of my life than make you feel that my love came with a price." "It doesn't come with a price?" "It comes with a standing interest rate, an annual review, and a penalty clause for insufficient vegetable consumption at supper." She hit his shoulder. He caught her hand and held it against his chest, where his heart was beating fast and hard beneath the leather and fur and the warm solidity of him. "Seraphine Marlowe," he said, "moonbound queen, most formidable woman in the borderlands. Will you choose me? Not because you need me. Not because I am useful. Not because my territory borders yours or my trade routes complement yours. But because I am the man who walked into a blizzard without a cloak to find you, and I would do it again every night for the rest of my life, and I would like the opportunity to also argue about supper. You are the most unromantic man I have ever met. You have mentioned this. I love you." "I know. Your rabbit told me." She kissed him. Or he kissed her. It was difficult to determine who moved first because they had been moving toward each other since the way station, since the blizzard, since the moment their eyes met across a common room full of soldiers, and neither of them had looked away. The moonlight was on them, the snow was on the mountains, the wind was cold, and his arms were warm, and somewhere inside Iron Ridge Keep, a white rabbit thumped once in her basket by the fire and went to sleep. Epilogue: The New Road. Spring came to the borderlands the way spring always comes, slowly, reluctantly, one snowdrop at a time. The Black Pine Pack survived the winter. Not just survived, thrived. The grain lasted, the medicine held, the firewood kept every hearth burning. The Salt Road reopened under new terms that Seraphine negotiated personally, with better rates and fairer access for the border merchants. The silver mine wagons resumed their monthly runs, and the Heartwood guildmaster, who had been worried about his contract for months, sent Seraphine a crate of the real cinnamon, not sawdust, the real thing, with a note that read, "For the only honest dealer north of the river, with gratitude and excellent spices." Brenna expanded her caravan operation to 12 wagons and became, within 6 months, the most successful independent hauler in the border trade network. She credited Seraphine publicly, frequently, and at considerable volume. Marta reclaimed her granary and ran it with the fierce, methodical joy of a woman who had been given back her purpose. She also adopted 3 cats to patrol the grain stores for mice, and she named the meanest one Garrett. Osric retired to a cottage near the archive, where he spent his days writing a history of the Black Pine Pack that placed Seraphine Marlowe at its center, because, as he said, history should record who actually kept the lights on. Finn, the young border guard, accepted his watchtower assignment with good grace and eventually fell in love with the daughter of the border baker, who appreciated earnest devotion and found, day or night, rain or shine, to be exactly the kind of thing she wanted to hear. Alara Winterbourne stayed. She managed the treasury with precision and care, and over time she began to laugh more and calculate less. She and Roderick did not have a happy marriage. The foundation of the marriage had been built on acquisition rather than love, but they had a working partnership, and Alara discovered that being useful for someone else's benefit, rather than her father's, was not the same as being weak. Lord Winterbourne sent 3 letters demanding her return. She burned all 3. She never heard from him again. Roderick Blackpine carried grain, mended roofs, guarded the border, and learned, slowly, painfully, one humbling day at a time, what it meant to serve. He watched Seraphine lead the pack he had nearly destroyed, and he watched her love a man who deserved her, and he did not complain. Some nights, when the moon was full and the wind carried the sound of wolves in the wild country, he stood at the edge of the pack territory and looked toward Iron Ridge Keep, where a light burned in the east tower, and he thought about everything he had lost. He did not go back. There was nothing to go back to. The woman he had loved was not the woman he had thrown away. She was bigger now, brighter, more herself than she had ever been when she was his. She had outgrown the space he had made for her, and the only honorable thing left was to be grateful she had saved his people despite what he had done to her. He was grateful. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. And Seraphine Marlowe, moonbound queen, steward of the Black Pine Pack, trade partner of the Border King, owner of the most opinionated rabbit in the borderlands, stood on the parapet of her keep in the first warm wind of spring, with Kale beside her and Clover at her feet, and the trade road stretching south, like a ribbon of possibility. And she looked at her kingdom and her king and her future, and she smiled. It was not a strategic smile. It was not a measured smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been thrown out, beaten down, stripped of her title, severed from her bond, offered a leaking cottage and a monthly allowance, and who had responded by buying back the debts of the people who betrayed her, outmaneuvering a northern banking dynasty, winning a tribunal with the help of a rabbit, and becoming a queen. It was in every way that mattered, the smile of a woman who had chosen herself, and who had been chosen in return by a man who understood that love is not about possession, but about standing next to someone in a blizzard and giving them your cloak. Clover thumped. Kale looked at the rabbit. The approval thump? The approval thump. Good. He took Seraphine's hand. I aim to maintain a satisfactory rating. Your rating is under annual review. I look forward to the performance evaluation. The spring wind blew, warm and full of promise, and the trade road was open, and the grain was in the granary, and the boots were on the children's feet, and the moon-bound queen stood on her wall with her king beside her and her rabbit at her feet and the whole bright, difficult, wonderful world ahead of her. And somewhere in the borderlands, a waystation innkeeper told a traveler the story of a golden-haired woman who walked out of a wolf pack with nothing but an account ledger and a rabbit and came back as a queen, and the traveler said, "That can't be true." And the innkeeper said, "Every word." I poured her first cup of tea. And the wind carried the story south, down the trade road, past the river towns and the merchant guilds and the coastal ports, until it reached the kind of people who needed to hear it. The overlooked, the undervalued, the women who kept everything running and received no credit, the ones who had been offered leaking cottages and monthly allowances and told they should be grateful. And those women heard the story of Seraphine Marlowe, and they looked at their ledgers, and they looked at their supply lines, and they looked at the small, warm, stubborn creatures that followed them through their days, the cats and rabbits and stubborn goats and loyal dogs, and they thought, if she could do it with nothing but a ledger and a rabbit and a spine made of silver, then so can I. Thank you for listening. Please follow Moonlit Romance Library for more Rejected Mate, Alpha Regret, and Chosen Love werewolf romances.